All right. Excuse me? S'il vous plaît. That's all right. I think it's a good time to start. Just before we begin, just a reminder that it's not too late to put the tickets from the tombola for the tombola in the box. It increases significantly your chance to win. All right. All right, and well, what a better way to end this conference than with a session on conservation science. So gather your remaining forces because for our grand finale, we are welcoming the senior researcher, Ana Rodriguez. Well, originally from Lisbon, Portugal, she first traveled abroad to pursue a PhD in Sheffield, UK, where she mastered the art of conservation biology. Then she took a skill overseas, working with leading conservation NGOs in the United States. Well, I guess it was more welcoming back then. But academia couldn't quite let her go. She returned to Europe as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Cambridge, UK. And soon after, she joined Montpellier, where she has been ever since, to our great delight. So she has received prestigious honor, including the CNRS bronze and silver medals for her groundbreaking work. Her research explores biodiversity across continents and centuries, looking at the ecological processes that shape life's distribution, the human activities that threaten it, and the lesson history can teach us about protecting it. So today she will bridge the gap between past and future to reveal new insight into biodiversity conservation. So please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Ana Rodriguez.
Thank you very much for this presentation, Etienne. Thank you very much to the organizers for having invited me to this conference, which I am looking forward to, given my level of stress has just shot up. Okay. Did you know that there's parts of the world where you can go and get really, really, really close to whales? Not just seeing them, but actually touching them. Where you can, not just you go and see the whales, but whales come and see you. And you can kind of even hug them. Has anyone seen this? Has anyone been to this place? Do you know what I'm talking about? I'll get a commission for the tours when you do this, because it looks like artificial intelligence, it looks like fake images, but these are actually real. So this is happening in a particular place, just one place. It's in Baja California, in Mexico. And these are in some three very shallow lagoons where the entire population of this species, which is the gray whale, will gather in the winter. So the females come, the pregnant females come and give birth. The non-pregnant females and the males come and make the babies for the next year, and the young just come to hang out. So the entire population goes there, they concentrate here, and not only you can see them, but they actually are very friendly. And let me just show you a little bit of video that kind of will bring home how weird this is. This is really something else. That's blowholes. So you have a mother and a calf there, and so I'm just going to quote from the blog of a Spanish tourist that went there last year. And this is Alberto Udri, and he said, when they find a calf, they clap their hands and shout. The calf is delighted by the clapping and approaches the ship, wanting to be friendly with them. They rub the calf's forehead briskly, and the calf finds pleasure in it. It's a very formal tourist. Sorry, I made a mistake. This is not Alberto who said this. It was not Alberto. It was, who said this actually? Oh, that's right. It was Al Udri who said this 1,000 years ago. So Al Udri, who was whale watching 1,000 years ago, and who was Al Udri and where was he coming from? He was coming from Al-Andalus. Al-Andalus was a Muslim territory in most of the Iberian Peninsula and a bit of southern France. It was a very developed, sophisticated society. It gave us beautiful things like the Alhambra Palace in Granada. mathematicians, doctors. It was an evolved society. And they had geographers, and Aludri was a famous geographer who went to explore the north. He went to the north of Europe to see what was going on there. And he came across the Vikings, the Norse, when he was there. And that's where he got this description from. And hold on, it's kind of not a whale watching trip, it's a hunting trip. So in fact, this is part of a description of a hunting trip. The Norsemen hunt the young of the whale from October to January, and they assemble in ships, having with them a great iron blade. Sorry, trigger warning, this is not going to be nice. With sharp spikes. In the blade is a great strong ring, and in the ring a strong cable. And when they find a calf, they clap their hands and shout. The calf is delighted by the clapping, approaches the ship, wanting to be friendly. They rub the calf's forehead briskly. The calf doesn't know what's coming. What's coming is that then they place a blade in the middle of the head, and with a powerful mallet, sorry, warning again, he strikes upon the blade. The calf struggles. Sometimes the calf hits parts of the ship with its tail and destroys them. And when weariness overtakes it, the crew of the ship take turns to drag it and bring the calf to shore. This is a part of, there's more to it, but I'm sparing you the details. So this is actually a very strange description, right? And if I had started by this description without showing you the video, you would think this is just part of those medieval tales, right? Full of monsters with weird stuff coming out of their heads and of their faces and stuff. And you kind of would just assume that this is something a bit made up, just, monsters and stuff. But because I showed you these images before, suddenly it kind of feels like this could be true, right? At least that's how it felt to me. So the whale, the description is actually quite, in a sense, objective, because it gives some clear information about what the whales are. So we know that they're large whales because the calf, so a baby whale, can destroy a ship, a boat. We know that they're coastal because they are able to drag the calf back to the coast. So this is not in the middle of the sea, they're able to drag it to the shore. And we know it's in the winter because that's what it tells us. And we have this friendliness stuff, right? These whales are approachable. So it kind of really sounds a lot, looks a lot, except for the part of the killing the whale. But the rest, the friendliness, it kind of does appear similar to what these gray whales are doing in their ecotourism areas. And now let me tell you a bit about this gray whale. So the gray whale is not there where Aludri mentioned this description. It only exists in the Pacific. Let me give you a little bit of a crash course on the gray whale. So it's a big thing. It's not the biggest of the whales, but it's one of the biggest. Several elephants large. What makes it most extraordinary as a species is that, unlike any other species of whale, so this is it's on its own family, it eats by sieving invertebrates from the mud, from sediment. So other whales will scoop big scoops of water and filter it through their baleen. Talking here about baleen whales, they will filter through their baleen, but this one will scoop bits of sediment and then filter to get the invertebrates that are in the sediment. And for this reason, so I'll just show you how it looks like when they do this, they leave these plumes of sediment. And for this reason, they only feed in very shallow waters. So they in shallow productive waters. This is the most coastal of the whale species. It's extraordinarily coastal. So its life cycle is that it spends summer in high latitudes, in the Arctic mostly, feeding again in coastal areas very close to the shore, very low depth areas. And then it makes these huge migrations. It's the mammal that makes the longest migrations known, of over 10,000 kilometers each direction. And it will go to these places I already mentioned to you, which are these lagoons, these precious lagoons, only 3 of them, where the entire population goes and reproduces, either giving birth or producing the babies of the following year. And this is where the tourists come and can see them. So it's very reliable, you can find them there. Now, then afterwards, so during this period when they are in the winter lagoons, they do not feed. The calves just get milk from the mother, and nobody else feeds. They just live of their fat, of their blubber, and then they go back in the spring. the mothers with the calves, everybody else by themselves, and they go back to their summer feeding grounds. So this is their ecology. There used to be, or there might be, I'll talk about this afterwards, another population migrating along the Asian coast. What we don't have is gray whales in Europe or in the Atlantic. So we don't, but we used to. Leave you in suspense now. I'll get some water. So it is only quite recently that we're still trying to understand what happened to the gray whales of the Atlantic. What's becoming clear now is that they used to be there and they were extirpated, so they became extinct. So the first record of gray whale in the Atlantic, the first first scientific evidence of its presence, was by this guy in 1861. He found some bones of some jaws that he couldn't attribute to any of the species that existed in the Atlantic, and so he described a new species. Just a few years afterwards, another guy in the Pacific gave a scientific name to the whale that was then alive there. Different names, but other bones appeared, and then some guys in 1937 connected the two and said, actually, this is the same species. And because of taxonomy, the first name gets priority. The whale is actually named after this type specimen is these bones in Sweden of the species that today only occurs in the Pacific. So at this point, people were thinking, okay, maybe it was a fossil. It was there in fossil time, ancient times. It's not necessarily something that would have occurred recently. Some more bones started to appear, and by the 80s, some people started looking, saying, maybe this species actually was here. Let's look for it in the historical record. It's not easy to find whales in the historical record. I'll spare you the details, but it's not easy to distinguish them. Often people don't give descriptive things, they just talk about big things, monsters, whatever. But there's only, even up to today, only 3 reliable descriptions that we are confident correspond to the gray whale. They all come from lists of whales. So it's places where people have made lists of the existing whales. And because we have those lists and we have attributes, we can exclude others. We can say, this is the right whale, this is the humpback. And so you can exclude others until you get just the gray whale, and it becomes clear that it is the gray whale. One of these, we don't know where it is. All of these are in a whaling context. So one of these, we don't know what it is. It was some whaling company telling their whalers the species that they could find. So we don't know where they got information from. But they mention it's a species that gives the best oil. This is the only illustration of gray whale from the Atlantic, and it was done by Jon Gudmundsen, who was an Icelandic naturalist who made a treaty on fish and whales. And so he has again a list, and he mentions this as a well-edible species, so it was something that was eaten. And then there's another paper, actually, in one of the early papers in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, a journal that still exists. And Paul Dudley made a list again of the whales that were being taken, that were being exploited in New England at the time. And so these are the only 3 reliable historical records of this species. More bones keep appearing. Actually, now with technology, with with ancient DNA, and with other methods, collagen analysis, for example, we're being able to identify really small bits of bones, things that before were completely impossible to identify. So more records are appearing of the gray whale on both sides of the Atlantic. And a picture is starting to emerge, although, as I said, the only historical records are those I mentioned, that it must have, based on the parallel with the Pacific population, it must have migrated along the European coast. Obviously, it was in Iceland. Maybe it was linked to Europe. Maybe it was the Icelandic population was linked to the American one. We don't know exactly where it was or what it was doing, but there must have been potentially 2 populations migrating to calving grounds in lower latitudes. What is becoming clear from the analysis of the records, and there's a paper in review that has reviewed these records for Europe, is that it was probably in Europe disappeared before, around the 13th century, through many, many operations of medieval whaling along the coast. Again, remember, this is the most coastal of the species, is coastal year-round, so it would have been accessible all year round. So it could have been taken, its breeding, its calving grounds, in its migration, and in its feeding grounds. In the Western Atlantic, we know it was present until later, and it was probably extirpated through what was already quite an advanced industrial whaling operation at the time. So it's gone. So now that we know that the grey whale was there, it becomes more plausible that description by Aludri was actually corresponding to this. But let me just sit here a bit for a moment and how many people knew that there had been people that don't work with me, that there used to be a whale, a full species of whale disappeared from the Atlantic before even it was described by science. And this is a species, not just any species, a species, coastal species, will come close to the coast. It's something that you would see. You would be able to, without necessarily a whale watching the expedition, to go to a long distance. This is something that would have been part of our lives, right? This would have been part of our fauna. It would have been something that belongs to the coasts of Europe and of America as well. So this is this idea that we forgot about the past, this kind of, in a sense, collective amnesia about the state of natural ecosystems. It's what Daniel Pauly called the shifting baseline syndrome. This idea that as ecosystems degrade progressively, if we all forget about it, we don't realize that we're living in a degraded ecosystem, right? So if in your lifetimes you will see forests disappearing or climate getting warmer or something, your concept of what's natural adjusts to that. And you get used to seeing, I don't know, you go snorkeling and you don't see much stuff, but it's normal. And then your kids will go and see even less stuff and it's normal. And then, you just, your expectations about what nature, or the potential of nature and how much you can, how wealthy, how rich it can be, just get downgraded, right? So this is the shifting baseline syndrome. And the idea is that you can only reverse it by having a better idea of what a natural ecosystem looks like. And history, looking back into history, can help us understand what things are when humans are not messing up with it. And I'm focusing on the grey whale example as an example of something where impact started actually much earlier than people thought it was possible. An entire population of a species, of a whale, I mean, it's not like, it's a whale, got taken from an entire ocean. It's kind of impressive, I mean, whatever. So anyway, so now we're getting this, it's getting more possible that what Aludri did see in those friendly whales was the grey whale. So there are other coastal whales, not as coastal as this one, but there are others. What really kind of, in my mind, makes it more likely that it's a grey whale, it's that the only one to which this kind of behavior applies. There's no right whales can also be coastal during their calving grounds, but we don't know of them having this kind of behavior. This really describes very well what people are doing in Californian whale watching. So it kind of makes it very likely that it's grey whales. Except that if you go 50 years back in time, it was not likely at all that this was grey whales. Because 50 years back in time, grey whales were not known as the friendly whale. They were called the devilfish. And they were called the devilfish because they were really dangerous. So whalers that have been taking them in the lagoons I mentioned where they were calving have description of them that go like this: in her frenzy will chase the boats, overtaking them, overturn them with the head, dashed into pieces with a stroke of ponderous flux. Many an expert whaleman has suffered in his encounters with them, and many a one has paid the penalty with his life. This was a dangerous animal. It was not. It was not an easy whale to catch. It was protecting its young. It was protecting itself. So it was called the devilfish, and it's actually in according with this, the Icelandic description I mentioned before does describe it as very tenacious of life, meaning that it will not die easily. It will protect itself. So how did the devilfish become the friendly whales? It kind of sounds like if we had analyzed this this text, the text from 1,000 years ago, 50 years ago, it would not make sense to call this the gray whale. It would just be like, no way, gray whales are known to be really aggressive. There's no way this could have been a gray whale. And yet, now the same gray whales that were the devilfish have become the friendly whale. So this is another example of shifting baseline, is that what we assume is the natural behavior, the natural ecology of a species may actually have been changed by our own actions. So what we think is normal, natural, what's natural habitat, natural behavior, all that may itself be corrupted by our own influence on the species. And it's something to keep in mind that this case illustrates very well. A few other examples of how this crossover between the historical records and the more recent data on the living species can help us just make sure that we're talking about the same species. The name in Iceland for the gray whale was the sandlesia, which means sand liar. So it lies on the sand. And the description looks completely ridiculous. Like, it lies on the sand as a seal for a whole day. Obviously made up stuff, right? It's not possible. But you have the whalers describing similar things. They get the ground and lie for several hours in two or three feet of water without apparent injury from resting heavily on the sand until the rising tide floats them. This is a very coastal whale. It's one that is capable of being in very shallow water, and it does it to actually to protect its young. It puts its young in very shallow water so that killer whales cannot attack it. But this, of course, would have made it more vulnerable to whalers. Another name that the Icelandics gave to this synonym was sandetta, which means sun eater. And again, it kind of wouldn't make sense if you hadn't had if we hadn't had the luck of having the real population, the live population with its not just bones, but the live population with its behavior, with its ecology. We would never understand this text. This text would be complete garbage, right? Lying on the sand, eating sand, garbage. But, oops, sorry. We know now it is the only whale species alive that does this, that actually eats sediment. So it's actually what sounds like text that sound like garbage suddenly become rich of ecological knowledge and information. Of course, they're not all like this, but distinguishing them is not necessarily easy. So now we know it has been extirpated in the Atlantic, but actually it came really, really close from being extirpated everywhere, because this species was whaled everywhere. So I've already mentioned that it was whaled in the Baja lagoons by American whalers. It was also whaled on the Asian coast, at least in South Korea, probably others as well. The Macaw are a tribe of North American indigenous people who actually still hunt whales today. They're one of the few people who have the right to still whale traditionally, according to the International Whaling Commission. So there's description of them, and this is a little drawing that shows their technique. And what you see. So what you see there is like little, think floaters. So they're throwing a harpoon, and they have a floater there, right? This is what the floater looks like. So this is the harpoon. It has a rope, and they would throw the harpoon, and then they could fasten to the boat, or they could leave the floater to indicate the position of the whale. And this is a carving in a walrus ivory. So the tusk of walrus, and you can see pretty much the same thing. So there's a whale there, which is probably a gray whale, and you see a line, and that's a seal. So I forgot to mention, but these are seal skins. So those are little legs of seals. So these are a seal, and you see the whalers with fastened to the boat. So this species probably has been exploited for thousands of years. This is the oldest description, the oldest drawing, certainly dated of whaling we have. So all of this whaling everywhere, the population in the Western Pacific has declined dramatically and has not recovered, and it's not even very clear if it still exists, because although people find whales here, which they thought was from that population, when they tagged the whales went there. So that was bad news. So we don't know still, it's not very clear if this population still exists. there's rare individuals seen here, really, really rare. This population, on the other hand, which also almost got extirpated, in particular when the whalers discovered the whaling lagoons, population crashed because then they were just killing the cows, they were killing the adult females, and this is just a recipe for disaster. So it was collapsing very quickly, and then the protection started. There was efforts to in particular, introduction of whaling in the lagoons, and the population started to recover to the point that. So this is the recent census. It kind of goes up and down. So there's some periods of heavy mortality. You might see it on the news, probably related to lack of food. But the population seems to be able to bounce back if given time. So it's considered that the population is now at carrying capacity, that it actually has recovered. Excellent news, right? This is one population, given enough time, given space, if we leave them alone, just recovers. So the species is now, the entire species is considered least concerned by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the Red List, even though it, of course, is very far from having recovered its full extent, because only one of the populations out of four is in good condition. So pretty much all we know about the species comes from this living population. And in particularly, we know that it calves only in these very shallow lagoons, tropical areas, and it's assumed that this is because it needs the warmth so that the baby whales, because they don't have much blubber yet, they want calm waters. And so there's this idea that this species really needs warm areas to reproduce. It also needs to be very protected because to protect against predation by killer whales. So this is what we know. Based on this, we assume that the winter calving grounds of the other population is somewhere there, but we don't know where. Actually, historically, we don't know. And we kind of don't know where those are. But we assume that they were somewhere in the south as well. Now, we have a problem here. And it's again, Al-Udri is giving us trouble. Because it kind of sounds like he's describing a calving ground, because of the time he's giving for the whales to be there corresponds more or less to the time where they're supposed to be in their calving grounds. And the rest of the description that I didn't tell you, it does show that the calves are accompanied by their mothers, so it's not young whale that they say the young of the whale, but it's actually calves still with their mothers. So it kind of, Al-Udri is messing up with us again, because this doesn't sound very logical that whales could have been calving that further up north. But what are the odds that the only calving grounds for this species that was highly whaled happen to be in a really remote part of their range? I mean, this is really remote. It's like almost an island. It's a peninsula. There's desert all around. There are not many people. There were people living there, but not many. There were not high densities of people. What are the odds that, this is speculation warning. I don't know if this is true. But it is suspicious that the only known grounds happen to be really remote areas for humans. And when I see the thing of this record here, I wonder, do we really know for sure that the whale needs these tropical areas? Could it have had a much bigger area of reproduction? And there's a kind of a tantalizing evidence, again, speculation, that it could have been the case, because I already mentioned to you the macaw whalers that still whale today. So these were well studied by ethnographers in the late 19th century, early 20th century. These were people that were really associated with whales. They depended on whales. It was very important for their livelihoods. They traded the whale oil. So these were very whaling people. And they have names for the months of the year, the moons. And the first moon is the moon in which the gray whale arrives. It's specifically the gray whale, not just any whale. And which is a bit weird, because they're in a migration route where the whales should pass through there twice a year, in spring and in autumn, and not necessarily arrive in the winter. So it's a bit weird. And even weirder is that they know when the gray whales young are born. This is biologically correct. They are born in January. Except that today they are born just there, many thousands of kilometers separated from where they live. So how did they know that? Speculation warning again. Just the possibility that maybe what we think we know about the grey whale today is actually, again, a diminished version of what the ecology of the species was before people started messing up with it. So why does this matter in practice, in real life? Because we don't know if these are the real only possible places where it can reproduce, or if it can reproduce there as well, which kind of changes the way we look at how to conserve these species, right? Because, for example, there's this news a couple of years ago. There's a baby who gave, there's a whale who gave birth to a baby a bit there, in Dana Point, a bit south of LA, out of the protected lagoons, out of the safe havens where they're supposed to be. And people are concerned. So this can be seen, people can interpret this as the whale was not doing well, or if the whale starts suddenly to give birth there, people will think this might be climate change, this might be because the lagoons are not getting good. People might see this as a problem. I don't know if this is a problem, it might be a problem, but suddenly looking at things from an historical perspective, we might interpret these records a bit differently. Could this be good news? Could it be that the whales are actually expanding their area of reproduction to match what it might have been before? Speculation again, I don't know if this is the case, but I just wanted to give you this as a possibility. Exactly. It's not my 10 minutes yet. Okay. It's not just the whales themselves, it's the things that interact with them. You had a plenary already about killer whales. Killer whales eat whales. So a lot of the ecology of these big baleen whales is done to try to escape and protect themselves from killer whales, which are very, very effective predators. So killer whales attack grey whales, in particular grey whale calves, a lot on their migration as they go north. So this is a dangerous migration. It's a long, dangerous migration. Why would they go through such a long, dangerous migration? Maybe they could like it like a shorter one. So what did we have this in the European waters? Turns out Pliny the Elder, of all people, a bunch of years ago, actually describes a scene that seems to come out of National Geographic. The balena, of course he said the balena, we don't know which species it is, it's a whale, we don't know which one, arrives at the winter solstice, the winter again, right biological information. At periodical seasons, it's a seasonal thing, happens every year, they retire and conceal themselves in some calm, capacious bay in which they take a delight in bringing forth. It's a calving ground. So it's describing it's the Bay of Cadiz in southern Spain, and he says that whales are coming. I don't know if it's the grey whales, it might also be right whales, by the way, different species, but they arrive and they come and calve in the secluded bay. Biologically matches exactly what the grey whale could be doing. This fact, however, is known to the orca, which attacks the balena in its places of retirement, which is teeth tears its young, or attacks the females which have just brought forth, and indeed while they're still pregnant. Lots of biological information here. The females arrive while they might still be pregnant. It's exactly what grey whales do. Right whales could apply to this case as well. So basically what this is telling us is that there was an ecotype, if you've seen Paul Tixier's presentation, there was an ecotype of orca, of killer whale, that ate big baleen whales in the entrance of the Mediterranean. And today we don't have this. Today we have a population of killer whales that eats tuna. If you've seen Paul's presentation, usually these hunting behaviors, they are inherited, they are taught from within matrilineal families. So we lost something here. We lost the killer whales that were dependent on these baleen whales. There are also other things that would have interacted with this. For example, California vultures that feed on the carcasses of the whales, all sorts of other scavengers. Our vultures in Europe might be missing the whales. Maybe the whales and the seals and the other things that we lost, maybe their populations, when we try to recover them, and they are now so dependent on domestic livestock, before they might be eating whales in the winter when they come and have their babies, and some babies die and stuff. Something else that might be missing the whales, the bear. So there's this description again in December, so again in the calving period, of a bear in Monterey Bay, California, feeding on a whale. Bears sometimes hibernate, right? These ones didn't. These ones were in December, they were eating whales. So maybe whales were important for the ecology of these bears so that they could stay without hibernating. This, by the way, is an extinct subspecies of the grizzly bear, which lives in the California flag, but not anywhere else. Today we still see bears feeding on dead whales. In this case, it's a grizzly bear feeding on a sperm whale in Alaska. So our bears could have be feeding other predators, wolves, whatever, might be feeding on the dead whales. And then when whales die in the sea, they fall. And when they fall, they create a new ecosystem, because at the bottom of the sea, there's very few nutrients. There's no light. It's kind of not very good down there. But there's very specific species, very specific ecosystems, and very sensitive, that actually depend on these falls of whales would have been big one, other fish might do as well, but whales are particular because they have all this blubber, all this fat. And so people have put cameras on it. I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's absolutely amazing. You let a whale fall and then you put cameras on it and all sorts of weird stuff appear and just clean the whale. There's weird octopi there, and even the bones get eaten by all sorts of stuff. So this is like its own ecosystem. And it's estimated that 95% of it is gone, just because the numbers of populations, the numbers of whales have declined so much. The other thing is that all of these migrations, and again, the gray whale makes the biggest migration of all, they're transporting nutrients. And remind what I told you, the gray whales, they will be feeding up there in the Arctic zone, which is very rich in nutrients. So they'll be feeding in high latitudes. And then they stop eating, they migrate, and here they're not eating, they're just pooing and peeing. So they're basically excreting nutrients that they have transported from here to there. And some people have calculated these, and it's actually quite important nutrient pump. The whale migrations are actually making an important transport of nutrients from highly productive areas to low productive areas, and which means that these ecosystems that don't have these whales anymore might be poorer than they used to be. The entire ecosystem might be less productive. Gray whales in particular have these sediment plumes that I already mentioned, because they scoop the sediment, so they kind of revolve the sediment continuously. And somebody has calculated, Elizabeth Alter, that this reworking of the sediments, it's actually as important for the Pacific population as all the sediment transported by one of the biggest rivers in the world, which is the Yukon River, which comes into the Alaska. So having species around, in this case, in their feeding areas, would have contributed to the productivity of these ecosystems in a way that we will never necessarily know what it was, because they're gone for now. Can they come back? Some people have proposed bringing them by helicopter. It's not going to work. But in a way, they're kind of coming back. So in May 2010, there was a whale, a gray whale. This was out of science fiction. People who that was seen first in Israel, and then it was seen the same. They can be recognized from their patterns of Barcelona, and it was the first live whale, gray whale, recorded for the Atlantic. It was a juvenile. It was in May, and then, weirdest of all, there was one in Namibia. First record of gray whale in the Southern Hemisphere. Whatever. And actually, during the lockdown, I don't know if any of you were in Montpellier remember, this whale passed in front of our coast. It passed, if you're going tomorrow to Frontignan, this whale passed in front of it. It was locked down, so I couldn't go. But some people did. It's on iNaturalist. Some people got records of it. I'm jealous. Actually, it was it's a juvenile. You can see it's not in a good condition. Again, same season. It died a bit afterwards. And just last year, there was another one in New England. So you have this kind of vagrants, right? These are all juveniles. They're only a bit of same season. These are probably a bit lost. They probably, we don't know where they come from, how they got here, but because, given that the world is round, They could have come, and it's potentially the most likely explanation, is that with the warming of the Arctic, the northern passage, so this area usually is blocked with ice, all year round ice, but with the warming of the Arctic, now this is starting to open regularly, which is why Donald Trump is so interested in Greenland. And then you can have shipping traffic, but also potentially whales going across. So this is one possible explanation, is that these individuals that would be feeding here just make a turn on the other side and find themselves on the wrong ocean. But we cannot exclude that they went through the air or that they went around, because the world is round, that they can travel a lot. So we don't know what these things are doing. They're juveniles, they are exploring around as lots of juveniles do. Could they come back? Maybe they could. I don't think it will be in my lifetime, but maybe it's in yours, that the population starts getting established. And if it does, at least that we know that it's not an invasion, right? That we know that it's recolonization. Because the phylogenetic data, so people have analyzed, again, Elizabeth Alter has analyzed the phylogeny of gray whales in the Atlantic and in the Pacific, and what they found was that it's all mixed. So there's not like a branch for the Atlantic and a branch for the Pacific. These are all mixed together, which suggests that there was actually quite regular crossover, quite regular migrations between the two. So the arrows there are the ones for the Atlantic, so in the middle of that. So these migrations might appear again, and over time they can colonize again. But will they have space? Will we give them space? Will we be ready to receive them? I just wanted to end by saying, I hope I've persuaded you that there are advantages and interest in looking into the past to understand the potential of the future. It doesn't mean that the species can recover necessarily to the levels that they were in historical times. It doesn't mean that we'll have huge populations of these whales anytime soon. But it kind of helps to unshift the baseline, to recalibrate what's possible, to recalibrate our idea of what's normal and natural, so that if these species do come, and if they arrive and if some species recover, we can see them as good news and not like an invasion of our space. So I hope I've persuaded you to go on whale watching in Southern California. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this very inspiring talk. Really helped, like, to put the baseline at its right place. I can't help but think, like, to requote the famous evolutionist, like, yeah, nothing in conservation makes sense except in the light of history. Thank you again, Hannah. Any questions?
Hi. So first of all, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering, what is your position talking about this ecotourism with people touching directly the ballenas? Is there any positive side or downside? How do you feel about it?
You mean for the well-being of the whales?
Yeah.
So the impression I have is that in most of the whale watching, people really stay away from whales so that they don't disturb them. They don't. And this is a calving ground, so there's really small babies there. What's weird about this part of the world is that it's the whales approaching the ships. So in a sense, it might still not be good for them. But in a sense, and this behavior has been increasing. So this is a behavior that's been, in the 70s, it started being known, people started coming. And now, like, I was looking at one of these tour operators, and they said, in one of the lagoons, there's on average 300 to 400 whales that do this, that come and the whales are playing. I mean, I don't think there's any risk for their health. I don't think they can get stuff from us or us from them. I could be wrong. But for me, it's kind of, it's magic to interact with another species, right? It's like, these are sentient things. They're thinking, we're thinking, looking at each other. This, I don't know, it's magical stuff. So I think the boats are stopped. The boats are not chasing them. The boats are, sorry, I can't talk. So I can't see the drawbacks. Right? And actually, I think it must be such magical. I've never been. I'm counting. I'll have a little tombola afterwards for you to give me money. No, but it must be such a magical experience that I think it's the best vaccination against whaling, right? Because whaling could come back. People could say, "Oh, just kill them again." But people get. I think it must be such an emotional experience to interact with these species that I think actually, if whales would come back to our part of the world, they would be treasured rather than being seen as a resource. So I don't know if I'll just.
Thank you very much for the talk. That was great. Really inspiring. And I was wondering, like it seems the behavior of the whale is changing a lot depending on how the people are interacting with them. So it sounds a bit counterintuitive that when Alarus went, they were hunting them and still they were friendly. So it sounds a bit like it was, well, hunting might have been a new thing at that time, or I don't know.
We'll speculate together. That's what I had exactly the same idea. These whales obviously were not used to being heavily hunted. I mean, if we take the description as at face value, if you look at the description of the other guy, Scammon, the one that was the American whaler in the lagoons, he describes how over time whales becoming more and more wary, and he says that the ones that are aggressive are the ones that have been attacked already. So he's obviously he's a very good naturalist. This common guy, and he's interpreting what he sees, and he sees the whale behavior changing, becoming progressively more aggressive during the period that the Americans were exploiting it. So I think you're probably right that what this would indicate is that the whales from the north, they were mostly naive, as in the individuals. I think they probably are naturally curious, which happens on many other species, that the babies are curious. It's a lot of calves that approach the ships. And they might approach just to see what's this other type of whale, because the ship kind of is a big thing floating in the ocean. So they might just be, but if they learn, and particularly if the mothers learn that it's a dangerous thing, then they will start becoming aggressive or avoidant. So the fact that they are not avoiding and they're not being aggressive probably indicates that it was low-level whaling, which kind of makes sense because until recently, whaling did not make sense at a large scale, because when you get a whale, it's huge. So you get huge quantities. The only way it makes sense to have a whaling industry is if you have trade. Because otherwise, if you kill a whale, everybody eats for a long time. And then they rotten, and there's... So subsistence whaling would never have been very high intensity. It's only when you start having trade that you would get a lot of whales being killed, and therefore a lot of whales experiencing the interactions with humans as a negative thing.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I love large mammals. I connect a lot with large elephants, like with elephants basically, because my totem is a lot like a link with elephants. I just wanted to know if there are people where those large whales come from, if there are people who connect with them, like sort of like a spiritual level to an extent, for their conservation, maybe like if they mean something to maybe to the locals who are used to them.
So I'm not an expert in this area, but I'm sure it is the case. I mean, from what I read, even the macaws, they had all sorts of mythology associated with whales, and whales being at the source of their own people. So there's a strong cultural link. I'm remembering something I read from news from Tasmania, yes, Tasmania, where some local people thought they would reincarnate in the whales. In killer whales in this case. So I'm sure people have made connections with when you have these animals that are... It's not just that the species, that they become individuals themselves, right? Because they have their individual behavior, they become used to people, and some are more friendly and others. You suddenly start having a connection which is one-on-one. It's not just a connection with nature, but the connection with individuals. Anyway, this is not my field of expertise, but I'm absolutely sure that has been many coastal areas where people have established deep connections with whales.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really a really nice story. I was wondering if actually some people try to modelize like the possible niche of this whale, and that basically in these models they were predicting that this whale could potentially actually live in along Europe and even in the south of the hemisphere.
Yes, there have been species distribution models, and the habitat is perfectly fine. In the southern hemisphere, it's an interesting thing because we don't have so much land mass in the southern hemisphere, right? You have Antarctica, and then you don't have the connections. So I'm not sure. It might be a different. Well, people have modeled. I don't know what constraints they've put on their model. It doesn't appear in the southern hemisphere, but I don't know if it's if they build it like that. Whether there would have been habitat, because there's this Namibia record, which is really weird. So there might be some pockets of suitable habitats where you would have these corresponding to polar, very rich, low level, low depth areas. But just by looking at distribution of landmass, you can see that there's not many of those in the southern hemisphere. It would be like the tip of, even it wouldn't be the same, like the tip of South Africa is not the same as Canada, right? The tip of Argentina would have some bits where it could have some of that habitat, but it's pretty much that, right? It would be the tip of Argentina, and then I'm just thinking about feeding grounds, areas where that would be similar to their current feeding grounds. There's just not much of it, maybe not enough to sustain a population. I don't know.
I was wondering if some people have tried to reconstruct like the past memory of the biodiversity based on human impact. Like, because now you have like this one story with the whale. Is there other stories like this where we can actually say that humans have highly impacted the presence of the species now? And like, is there some kind of review about this impact to show the people this is basically how we have shifted the baseline so far?
What you're asking is not a small you're asking for a huge amount of things, and people have been working on different ways in which humans have impacted ecosystems for a long time in different ways. So one of the obvious one is the Pleistocene extinctions, the killing of the very large mammals at the end of the Pleistocene, so the end of the last ice age. There's a debate in the literature whether that was human overkilling or if it was climate change, but a lot of people think that humans were already getting rid of very big animals, therefore profoundly impacting ecosystems across entire continents. Coincidence or not, when humans got into Australia, the big kangaroos, all of disappeared. Maybe climate change, maybe humans. Coincidence or not, when humans entered into North America, big things disappeared. Maybe humans, maybe climate change. But we know that these impacts have started a long time ago. In the marine system, it's mainly coastal systems that have been affected earlier. Whales, it's a kind of a bit of a surprise that we can get rid of an entire whale so early because it seems like the ocean is so big, but this was a very coastal whale. Anyway, I didn't reply to your answer because there's not one person doing this. There's a lot of people working on different facets of this.
Maybe one more question.
Thank you for your talk. Maybe it's a bit of a naive question. I'm not very familiar with conservation policies, but what you said gave me the impression that when designing a conservation policy, we should look into maybe historical archive to do the assessment of what it means for a population to be in good health, to maybe struggle against this amnesia that we have. Do you recommend doing this? And do you know if it's already being done in some places?
Yeah, so in some cases, there will be a policy which says that the species has to be maintained to a healthy level or to so, for example, another species of whale, which is the right whale, there's a species in the Atlantic which is doing really badly. There is actually, how should I say this? The International Whaling Commission, let me get back. at some point, people of the world agreed to stop whaling industrially. There's a whaling moratorium that's still in place right now that people have signed to say that they will not whale industrially because the populations of whales had collapsed completely. And this is done by the International Whaling Commission. People sometimes think that the International Whaling Commission is a commission to protect the whales. It's not. It's an International Whaling Commission. It's not an International Whale Conservation Commission. And so actually the moratorium is subject to the populations recovering. So at some point, if people think the populations have recovered, whaling could start, according to this commission, according to this that lots of countries have signed to. So understanding what is the recovery is actually quite important in this particular case. In the case of the countries agreeing or not that they would start whaling again, it's actually conditional on the populations having recovered to their sustainable levels of exploitation. And so if we're completely underestimating what the population size is, if we think the natural population size is 1,000, when in fact it was 10,000, this makes a big difference for whether whaling can come back. And whaling still happens. Some countries do whaling, like Iceland and Norway. So it's not like abstract situation. Other cases, it will be like whether the species is in the Endangered Species Act in the US or in the Natura 2000 or something, is conditional to being in a favorable conservation state. And so this definition of favorable, if it should be informed by this historical perspective. But sometimes we don't have the information. Sometimes people think that they are using the right baseline and they don't.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Well, just 1 minute so that everybody can leave quietly. Well, if you, yeah, I gotta see. All right, for our next presentation, we are staying big. We are still thinking large scales, both in space and taxonomically. Our speaker is going to present fascinating patterns in vertebrate abundances across the ranges. So please welcome the great Felipe Serrano from the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here once again. I'm going to show you what I did during my first years of a postdoc in Brazil, basically dealing with the interface of macroecology and conservation. So this one, yeah. So we all know that climate is one of the major drivers of range. In some places, species cannot occur because it's too hot or because it's too cold. What happens now is that as climate change happens, a lot of places are undergoing increases in temperature, and so the climatic suitability of places is changing. And so in some places, there you go, the temperature is getting too warm for populations to persist in, where in other places it's actually becoming warm enough for them to actually colonize. And so a few species, not all of them, track climate change. So actually we have this edge is actually changing, so that it's becoming way too hot for them to persist in, and some edges are actually changing, so species are sort of undergoing range shifts. Theoretically, they're moving towards the poles, and we have then the cold edge, which is often called also the leading edge because it's leading the advance, and also the warm edge, which is the trailing edge as well because it's getting left behind. And there's a lot of evidence that says that this is happening. A lot of articles have already focused on it with conflicting results, because you can see that at the cold edge, a lot of species are indeed undergoing range shifts towards the poles, but a few of them, even at the cold edge, are undergoing equatorward range shifts, so they're moving towards the equator. And at the warm edge, actually, everybody's doing their own thing. They're going up and down, north and south. But you may ask, what about abundance? And that's a very good question. Thank you for asking. What happens is that obviously abundance is intrinsically linked to borders, to distribution. The border is nothing more than the threshold between areas where we have zero abundance and areas where we have at least one individual, right? So as range shifts are changing, this is on gray here, is the abundance of this particular species. These are all different populations. And so you can see as range shifts towards the poles, the abundance is also changing so that eventually these populations go extinct. And then we have some recolonizations towards the cold edge of the species distribution. And so what we end up having is this, where theoretically populations here are decreasing up to a point that they go extinct. And in some places, we actually are seeing increases in abundance, or that's what we expect. So we devised these two hypotheses in which we think that populations have a higher probability of increasing at their warm edge, right? They're decreasing more, they're going more extinct at the warm edge, and that decreases towards the cold edge. And conversely, we have a higher probability of increasing in abundance closer to the cold edge, and that decreases as we move towards the warm edge. So these are the two hypotheses that we have. We collected a lot of data for vertebrates only, using two main databases. So Biotime, which is this major database with more than 400 authors, and also the Living Planet Index, in which we also published a study dealing with how different languages are also adding different data. We did it with Portuguese, but we're actually doing it with French as well. And so we gathered data for time series that have at least 2 years, because we need to have this delta of abundance, right? But usually they have more than 2 years. And then we got a lot of populations for the same species. Once we did that, we calculated the average change in population size, and we classified it as either decreasing, constant, or increasing. We also gathered species distribution with some criteria such as, for example, no islands, since their edges are not climatically defined, but more geographically defined, right? And then we used the maximum latitude and a minimum latitude to define what is the cold edge, what is the warm edge. And we used the latitudinal range to assess, for example, this population here, how further relatively to its own latitudinal range, how further away it is from the cold edge, and conversely, how far away it is from the warm edge. And then we did for all populations that we have, for all vertebrates. And we tested this with a Bayesian approach in which we tested if the probability of decreasing is being driven by the relative distance to the warm edge in this case, because it's decreasing. So this is at the level of the species distribution. Also taxonomic differences, because we have different groups with different important differences, for example, in thermoregulation. We had to exclude reptiles because we didn't have enough data. And also latitude, which is basically the absolute distance to the equator. And this is because it might matter not only where it is within its range, but also where it is in the world. So for example, here you may have 3 species with three different populations. They have the same distance to the cold edge here, but they might be at different latitudes. And so perhaps they have different probabilities of decreasing or not. On the other hand, we have 2 different populations for 2 different species at the same latitude. And so it might not matter where it is within the range, but where it is in the world. And if it's like that, then only latitude would matter, not where they are within the range. We include pairwise interactions and also included a species-specific slope, so for each specific species, and also using, obviously, species as a random effect, and also the last year that specific population had been assessed. And the same, we did the same for the probability of increasing in relation to the cold edge, so it's basically just the mirrored hypothesis. This is what we got. So at the global level, that doesn't seem to be a very strong pattern. If you look at it, besides major gaps in some areas, most of them which are actually very biodiversity rich, so northern Mexico, the Amazon, sub-Saharan Africa, China. And once you look at within the species ranges, you can see that the edges are rarely actually assessed. There's not a lot of monitoring going on at the edges of species distribution, but also that both birds and mammals, they're mainly assessed towards their warmer edge rather than their cold edge. And the opposite happens for amphibians. So were our hypotheses corroborated? Not really. There was no strong evidence, even though they go into the direction that we expected. Our credible intervals overlapped 0, so we have no certainty to say that they're actually decreasing. So we didn't corroborate any of our hypotheses. However, things get a bit complicated once we start looking at groups. So different groups are doing different things. you can see that amphibians are doing what they're supposed to do. They're following the plan, but birds and mammals are not, and especially mammals, there's strong evidence they're just doing the opposite of what they're supposed to do. And the same is happening for birds regarding the probability of increasing. So mammals are actually decreasing in abundance more at the cold edge than they are at the warm edge, and birds are actually increasing more at the warm edge than they are at the cold edge, which is completely against what we expected. But what about latitude, which is one also of our strong hypotheses that could be driving these patterns? For the probability of decreasing, the slopes are the same. So basically, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. What matters is how distant you are to your warm edge. And so there's not a very strong effect of this. But once we look at the probability of increasing, we see that things change a bit. So here, the more purple, the more temperate the population is, the more green, the greener, the more tropical the population is. And so you can see that they have different slopes. So what this means is basically that if you're at your very cold edge, so if you're here at your very cold, so at the coldest you can get, the probability of increasing is roughly the same. But as populations are assessed towards their warmer edge, this probability changes. So you can see that if they're at their very warm edge, the probability of increasing is much higher for temperate species than it is for tropical species. So tropical species at their warm edge are actually increasing much less than we expected them to, comparing to temperate populations. Okay, and what happens if we actually look at a species level? So if we look at individual species and see what's going on with them. So we have this, if they all follow the plan, as amphibians did, that they have a higher probability of decreasing at the warm edge and a higher probability of increasing at the cold edge, we would get this. So we would get poleward range shifts that would be moving towards the poles. Whereas if they do the opposite, they would be actually moving towards the equator, right? We have the mirrored graphical hypothesis here. And we have different combinations that we can have. So for example, if they're decreasing if they're increasing at one end, but not decreasing at the other, we would have expansion. And if they're decreasing at one end, but not increasing at the other, they could be constant, we would have contraction. So once we do that, we put it all together for all species. What we get is that they're all undergoing range shifts, all directions, everyone's doing their own thing. Nearly all of the species are undergoing some sort of range shift, but it's sort of the same percentage that's moving towards the poles or moving towards the equator. And the next steps that we still have no idea what the hell is going on, to be honest. But now we're going to look at how phylogenetic structure might be driving these patterns. If some families are doing one thing, some are doing the opposite. Which traits are actually important to drive this, which may be a bit major driver of abundance change as well. And how can we apply this to conservation? So all in all, we now know that range dynamics are a bit complex. I mean, who would have thought, right? Obviously, it's at all vertebrates of the world at the global scale. Most species are indeed undergoing range shifts, and we might need to look at who the species are rather than just putting them all together and see what happens. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for my co-authors, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions?
Hi, thank you for your nice talk. I was thinking about migratory species which have distinct breeding and non-breeding grounds. Did you use the whole range? Because it's probably very different.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, we thought of it. So we're only using the resident ranges, not the migratory ranges. So where species actually breed and are residents, rather than their whole migratory range, right? So where they actually breed, and that means that we could sort of assess their population abundance at a finer scale rather than using migrant ranges.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Philippe. I was wondering whether you could expect to have differences between the two hemispheres, as the geographical constraints are quite different, with like an opening of the landmass in northern and a shortening and like a closing thing in the southern one.
Yep, I think for sure, even the two, so northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere are undergoing different patterns of habitat loss, different areas for sure. We looked here only at absolute latitude, so how far it was from the equator. But the next step obviously is having 2 dimensions, see what's going on. But I think it's expected. Then again, there's this huge imbalance of data, so we don't have a lot of data. That reminds me, so if you have any data that on a temporal series of abundance, especially tropical species, you're more than welcome to collaborate. But I think we still don't have enough data, or still need to explore it a bit further to see what's going on, because most data that we have is in the northern hemisphere.
Maybe a last question?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I'm just asking, maybe you had some data about arthropods and insects, because maybe all these like mammals, birds, and amphibians may be eating insects and just following the food sources instead of escaping the heat.
Yep, that's obviously, I mean, the most biomass on the planet Earth is actually arthropods, right? So the databases that we have, they do not include arthropods. We thought about it. I would be happy to include them. But at this time, I think there's data is still, I mean, we could use it, but there's different, very important taxonomic things and different, especially lifespans. So it would be a great idea, especially to connect the two of them, because like you said, this might be driving the patterns that we're actually seeing, as well as biotic interactions, competition. But so far I haven't used it. I'm interested in using it for sure. Even plants might be a good model as well, but yeah, would be a good plan moving forward for sure.
Okay, thank you, Philippe.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Philippe. Thank you again. So, well, for our next talk, it might feel very familiar because it's about response to heat stress, but not in humans, in king penguins this time. So please give a very warm, but not too warm, welcome to Colin Richard from the University of Strasbourg, France.
Thank you. So, hi, good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, I'm really glad to be here to be able to talk to you about king penguins' response to heat stress. And I'm presenting my master's thesis results here. So, first of all, we already heard about it, the king penguins, which came from the Crozet archipelago earlier during the conference. And so we're studying them because they live on subantarctical islands, and these islands are predicted to be increasingly warm in the 21st century, something about 4 degrees Celsius more. And the thing is that they are cold adapted animals, so they are more likely to suffer from heat stress. Especially since king penguins, they forage in 4 degrees Celsius water in cold waters for most of the year. And during their breeding season, they breed on land in a colony. And during this period, that's the austral summer. So that adds to the stress. And they have to take foraging trips back to at sea every around 2 weeks. So they form a breeding pair. And then they lay the egg, and there's one incubating parent, and the other one goes at sea foraging to have food, which means that they have no plasticity in their body insulation, since they have to go back in cold waters. And the thing is that the incubating parent has to stay with the egg, so they cannot go cool down in the nearby river, and they have limited to no shade, because it's like an island with very limited vegetation. And they have put thermometers on their back feathers, which are black, And if you look at it, you can see that on a daily maximum, the temperature on their back can go up to 40, sometimes 50 degrees, which means that they have a very, very heavy radiative heat load. And a recent study from Aude-Noiret described that 20% of the individuals are panting at middays, which means that they are displaying heat stress behavior. So now our question is, what is the impact of warm environmental conditions on the physiology of incubating king penguins? Classically, when we study thermal stress in different animals, especially in king penguins, we use air temperature and sometimes humidity. But solar radiation and wind speed, as we can tell, they are very important in thermal stress and they are not taken into account. So in this study, we studied those 4 weather climate variables and their relationship with panting, which is the primary heat regulating behavior, heart rate, which is a proxy for metabolism, and body temperature, internal body temperature. And our hypothesis is that body temperature will stay level or increase with warm environmental conditions, depending on how well they thermoregulate. And that the heart rate will stay level based on those data which were acquired in captivity, or that it will decrease because when they're in thermal stress, they will just stay very inactive, something like that. And so the heart rate would decrease. So how did we acquire those data? For the panting, we did behavioral observation every 3 days for 40 minutes. So that's a discrete data, it's not continuous. However, for temperature and heart rate, we have continuous data. With temperature, we have internal data because this is an aneupil, so they eat the thermometer, and penguins are fasting during the summer and the time they are in the colony. So that allows us to have weeks of data in the temperature. And for the weather data, we have them from the Météo France station. So first of all, we are looking into the probability of observing panting, so heat thermoregulating behavior, according to body temperature. And what we can see is that as body temperature increases, so how do I do that? No, it doesn't work. As body temperature increases, we have an increased probability of observing panting. And if we look at the relationship between still panting on the y-axis, but environmental conditions on the x-axis, we can see that under hot environmental conditions, so high solar radiation, low wind speed, and high air temperature and humidity, we have an increased probability in panting. So then we looked at the relation between body temperature and those environmental conditions, and we expect an influence of the environmental conditions. So I did mixed models, first one without interaction to have every climate variable separately. And on body temperature, we see that there's only an effect of wind speed, which body temperature decreases with an increase in wind speed. And when we go a bit more in details, I put interaction between the weather variables, and I only kept the significant one in the models. And the significant one is between wind speed and solar radiation, which we already seen was had the biggest impact on panting. So if we focus here on the left part of the graph with low wind speed on the x-axis, you can see that at low wind speed, we have a high body temperature and a high solar radiation, which is the darkest color. But at high wind speed, under the highest solar radiation, we have a lower body temperature. And then we looked also at the heart rate, so proxy for metabolism, and the interaction with environmental variables. And then we see that there's an impact of each one in the model without interactions. And we see that heart rate decreases, which was coherent with our hypothesis. It decreases under hot environmental conditions. And in the model with interaction, we have the same interaction that is significant. And if we focus on the left part of the graph, so low wind speed, we see that at the higher solar radiation, we still have a low heart rate. So that's coherent with what we just had before. And we see that heart rate decreases under hot environmental conditions. So our conclusion is that king's penguin body temperature and heart rate are significantly influenced by environmental conditions, and that they have a possibility of behavioral thermoregulation, which they use according to these environmental conditions. So we see an increase in panting under this very warm environmental condition, especially under solar radiation and wind speed. And that's important because we saw that wind speed plays an important part through convection, especially above 6 meters a second. We see that there's no panting, and when wind speed is above 8 meters seconds, we see that there's a stronger influence of the wind than in solar radiation. And I don't know if you remember, but I said that classically studies focused on air temperature. And so that means that the two strongest environmental conditions that we had here were the ones that were classically ignored. So yeah, that's an idea that would be nice to take into account in future papers. To put that a little bit in perspective, we used a weather station that was located a kilometer apart from the colony. So that means that the wind conditions are a bit stronger on the weather station. So we propose to use microstation black built in the future within the colony to account for the microclimate and especially the different density in the colony. I said that we did behavioral scans every 3 days, and so that means that the data is not continuous. And we have accelerometers on certain penguins so that we could use the accelerometers to see when they are moving very fast, and that indicates panting. Also, the warming expectation in the subantarctic island are plus 4 degrees. And during this season, it was hot, but not especially hot. It was not a heat wave season. So we would repeat this analysis in warmer field sessions to account for the expected global warming. And lastly, we had effects here on the penguins. We saw panting, we saw heat stress sign, but we did not see lethal effects. And so we suggest to have a reproductive success monitoring, because even if there's no lethal effect, there might be an effect on the population through reproduction success. And with that, I would like to thank everybody who worked on the field and on this study, and thank you for your attention.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I just have a question. Imagine that there are like unpredictable changes in temperature, like now is like with climate change, like a hot and a cold or hot, like it depends on the season. So do you think that these changes that you observe will be consistent, or what do you expect?
I didn't understand what the beginning of the question. So if there's...
So in the case that there is, instead of increasing temperature, that there are unpredictable changes in the temperature, like rising and decreasing, do you think that these changes will be consistent, or there will be like some other...
So that would depend on the changes, because the weather is actually already a bit unpredictable between days. You can have days with a lot of wind speed, and just after that, days with a lot of air temperature, very high air temperature. So we already have quite big changes that they have to account for.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for the talk. Maybe I missed it, but what is the normal temperature for a penguin, and at what level can you consider it dangerous for their immediate health?
That's the thing. So the temperature they are in the water, it's 4 degrees Celsius, or something like that. When they're on land, they are subjected to temperature between 0 degrees and like 15 or even 20, but that's the very hottest day. The thing is, air temperature and humidity are not the one who are the most impactful on the penguins. And if you have something like cold day, but very, very high solar radiation, if you have like 10 degrees Celsius water, which is kind of okay for them, but like 300 in solar radiation, they're not going to be okay. So that's the thing, you cannot predict it. You have to do strong models with those 4 variables to be able to predict it.
Yeah, thank you. But just my question was more on internal temperature of a penguin.
So sorry. So that's interesting with the methods. Actually, those anipills are meant for humans, and they have quite similar body temperature and heart rate to humans. So they are something around 37.7 degrees. And we saw, I think I have 1 or 2 points above 40 degrees. But they're really unwell at that point. Above 38.2, I believe I saw them having an increase in panting.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Did you make your observations from individuals? I imagine that they live in colonies.
Yes.
Did you observe individuals in the periphery of the colony only, or did you make observations of those in the core part? Because maybe the conditions for those are more severe, for example, more solar radiation and less possibility of getting wind because they're blocked by the others.
So I wasn't in the field, but I believe that I know the answer. And the thing is, these penguins, we have several couples that were followed or several individuals, and they come back and they go. So they have different part of the colony. But there was also a study based on whether the stress is different given the density of the colony, and there is more stress for the individuals where there's a higher density.
Thank you. Okay, first a follow-up question to that. So they use this getting together and staying together strategy to keep warmer. Is that correct?
No, they don't act like the emperor penguins.
Okay, so
they already warm and they kind of aggressive. So the fact that it's denser, it's more stressful for them because they attack each other.
okay, I see. And actually, my question was about the reproductive part. Yeah, I was also thinking about it when you were talking. Maybe you could see if the hatching is earlier in the ones that are incubating at that period. But did you think of another factors, like what were you thinking of looking at for reproductive traits?
So the thing with early or late reproductive is that king penguins have like a year-long reproduction cycle, and they like some have early reproduction and some have a late reproduction. And if they have early 1 year, they might have late another year. So it would be a bit difficult to know whether it's early or late because of the temperature, because they're already sometimes a month or two between different couples, egg laying and things like that.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you.
And now for our last talk before the coffee break, we are sticking with birds. But the birds this time that actually can fly and from a much more tropical place. So please give a very warm welcome to Vinnie Jane from Oxford Brookes University, United Kingdom.
Hello. Hello, everyone. My name is Vinnie Jen, and I'm a PhD student at Oxford Brookes University. And I'm talking today about part of my PhD, which is about the impact of farming patterns on bird life in West Bali's agroforests. So I want to start the presentation by talking about deforestation and the role of agriculture. Deforestation is a major problem across the globe, but especially in the tropics. Agricultural expansion is the top driver of pantropical deforestation, and it's linked to 8.8 million hectares of forest lost every year, and it accounts for more than 90% of deforestation around the world. But the food that we eat and consume and grow is only increasing every year, and the demand for agricultural commodities is projected to increase by 70 to 100% by 2050, and experts predict that there may not be substantial tropical forest remaining by the end of the century. So meeting the rising global food demands while preventing further biodiversity loss and habitat loss is a critical challenge for the 21st century. Research shows that the top drivers of deforestation are cattle, like deforestation due to pasture expansion for cattle, which is driven by consumption of beef, oil palm plantation expansion, and commodity crops such as cocoa, coffee, and rubber. My talk today is about Indonesia, so I want to talk specifically about Indonesia just for a little bit. This map shows all of the forest that was lost in Indonesia between 1950 and 2017, and as you can see, there's been substantial loss. All of the red areas show forests that have been lost. And this is especially worrying because Indonesia is one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. It's home to much of the world's remaining tropical forest, and unfortunately, it's also a deforestation hotspot. It's home to 2 out of 36 global biodiversity hotspots, Sundaland and Wallacea, which are biologically rich and very threatened. It's home to rare and endemic species, many of which we have never even described, especially in places like Papua New Guinea, but even in the smaller islands, there's insects and small animals that have never even been identified. Agriculture isn't just a driver of deforestation, it's a major source of income for Indonesians, and it's a major sector of the economy. And most Indonesian farmers are smallholder farmers who occupy less than 1 hectare of land. So for them, earning money off of their land is obviously very important, which leads us to the struggle of how do we grow enough food, and also how do we prevent further biodiversity loss. But agriculture is a very broad term, and what makes some type of agriculture worse than others for biodiversity specifically, when you have monoculture farms which have low habitat complexity, native plants and animals, it becomes almost impossible for them to use such habitats. So recently there's been a lot of work that's been going on, especially in the tropics, about agroforestry, where you integrate trees and shrubs into the farmland, which can potentially increase the complexity of the habitat on the farms and make the farms more biodiversity friendly. But this is a very generic statement, and a lot more detail is required, and all of this is so context specific. So if we say that we're integrating trees, how many trees and which types of trees? Are they native? How much does that cost for a farmer? How many types of crops is the farmer growing? And when you do something like agroforestry, is the yield sustainable for farmers? Is it even financially viable? So, and when we say that this can be biodiversity friendly, what types of biodiversity does this support? And potentially this might even harm some types of biodiversity, right? So one of the central questions about my PhD is which arrangements of crops and trees can support biodiversity whilst also maintaining yields for farmers? So to answer this question, we have a study site in Bali, which is a small island in Indonesia in Sundaland. Bali is known a lot for tourism, but the western side of the island has a lot of primary intact forest, the edges of which are used by farmers for agroforestry. So in our study site, we have protected forest, and then in which there's no crops being grown. Adjacent to that, we have what we call rustic agroforest, where a lot of the native forest trees are retained, but crops are also being grown. And then we have polyculture agroforest, where there's a big diversity of crops, but no forest trees. So this is a photo of a polyculture agroforest where farmers are growing more than 10 types of crops, such as coconut, banana, coffee, clove, nutmeg, and a bunch of other things. And the canopy here only consists of cropping trees. The rustic agroforest also has multiple types of cropping trees, but it also has these massive, big native forest trees, and the canopy is more of a forest-like canopy. So the rustic agroforest is slightly more complex than polyculture agroforest. So we wanted to compare biodiversity between these 2 types of agroforests, and we also wanted to know how things like the diversity of crops, the diversity of trees, how does that affect biodiversity? So to answer this, we set up 25 meter by 25 meter plots in both types of habitat. We set up 53 plots in total, and we assessed, in each plot, we know what crops are being grown, what are the forest trees, what's the canopy cover, and approximately what yield are farmers getting annually in each plot. We measured biodiversity in many ways, but one of the things that we did was bird point counts. So a bird point count consists of an expert trained observer who notes down all of the birds that they see or hear within, let's say, 10 minutes. And we did this kind of sampling twice for each plot. And with all of the data, we divided the birds into their foraging guilds, which means dietary guilds, like whether they're frugivores and they eat fruits, or invertivores, which eat insects. And then we calculated the abundance, the number of species, and the diversity of birds in each plot. So with all of these plot-wise variables, I ran models, mixed models, spatial models, additive models, to understand the relationship between variables. And this is what, just to know what it sounds like to do a bird point count in an agroforest. It's not very loud. And this was our local expert who calls himself Birdman, who helped us collect all of this data. And so just a reminder that the polyculture has no forest trees and the rustic have crops which are grown alongside the forest trees. So if we look at the difference between birds, between the two habitat types, what we found is that frugivorous birds, which primarily eat fruits, they have higher abundance, more species, and more diversity in the rustic agroforests, whereas the omnivorous birds, which eat a diet consisting of plants and insects, have higher abundance, more species, and more diversity in the polyculture agroforests. So frugivores like the rustic system and omnivores like the polyculture systems, but we wanted to disentangle this a bit further, and because we know the vegetation characteristics for each plot, we tried to look at how things specifically like canopy cover, elevation of the plot, the number of crops being grown in the plot, and the number of types of forest trees, and the yield in each plot, how do they specifically relate to abundance, richness, and diversity? So for all of the birds combined, what we found is that the number of types of forest trees positively influences the total abundance of birds. It's like a weak relationship, but you can see that beyond 3 to 4 types of forest trees, tree types, the abundance of birds goes up. We also found that as the yield per plot goes up, the total number of bird species goes up to a certain point, but then beyond, let's say, $500, as the yield increases, the number of bird species starts declining again. Specifically looking at the fruit-eating birds or the frugivores, what we found is that the number of types of crops had a negative impact. The red line is negative, has a negative impact on the number of species of frugivores and the diversity of frugivores, but the number of types of forest trees had a positive influence on abundance, richness, and diversity of frugivores, which again kind of supports the idea that frugivores thrive more in the rustic agroforest where there's native forest trees. For invertivores, which are birds which primarily eat invertebrates, what we found is that the number of types of crops had a positive influence on diversity, and the number of types of trees had a positive influence on abundance as well, again showing a higher increase above 3 to 4 types of trees. So invertivores seem to like high crop diversity and high tree diversity. For omnivores, which have a more flexible diet, they can feed on a variety of plant matter and a variety of invertebrate matter. We found that the number of crop types had a positive influence on the number of omnivorous species, but the number of forest tree types had a negative influence on the overall abundance. And so this kind of, again, supports the idea that omnivorous birds thrive more in the polyculture agroforests. But what does all of this mean for farming? So what my results so far show is that retaining a diverse number of forest trees in an agroforest is definitely beneficial for frugivores, such as hornbills, barbets, and fruit doves, and invertivores, such as drongos, minivets, and woodpeckers, especially if you have more than 3 to 4 types of forest trees in your farm. It positively influences frugivores especially. Having fewer forest trees and diverse crops supports omnivorous birds, such as bulbuls and sunbirds, potentially because in the areas with more diverse crops, they have less competition with the frugivores and the invertivores, and because their diet is more flexible. Both rustic and polyculture habitats are important for different bird groups, but removing the native forest trees would especially have negative impact for frugivores. Overall, we didn't find any significant relationship with yield except for overall the number of species of birds, where we found that after a certain point, the total number of bird species starts going down. And what this kind of means is that up to a certain threshold, in such diverse multi-crop systems, high yields and biodiversity can go hand in hand, and you can make your farm more biodiversity friendly without having to compromise on yield up to a certain point. Especially retaining large forest trees can serve as an important conservation strategy in such landscapes, especially for frugivores, because we found no significant difference in yields between rustic or polyculture systems. And one of the major things from my PhD and from this research is that indigenous farming styles deserve a lot more attention. All of these farms are community managed, and a lot of this farming style is indigenous Balinese culture. And If we look at modern monoculture industrial farming, which has been so damaging to biodiversity, to the soil, I think we can learn a lot from indigenous farming systems where there's a lot more, less use of chemicals and more reliance on a diverse array of crops. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. Or in Indonesia, they say terima kasih. And I want to thank my supervisors, Marco and Andy, all of our collaborators in Bali, and obviously like Birdman, who helped us collect all of the data, and the farmers who let us stay with them in the village for like months on end. The local university in Bali, Warmadewa University, Conservana Spices, which is a social enterprise in Bali who we work with, who also support the farmers, and the government of Indonesia for giving us permits for doing this research. We're also studying spiders across these agroforests and looking to see if there's differences, and we're also looking at bats and mammals. And we're also doing interviews with the farmers to try to understand the role of the house, to understand socioeconomic factors and cultural factors and spiritual factors that influence the way that they farm, and eventually how does that affect biodiversity on their farms. Thank you.
I really loved your presentation. I was following through the whole time. Honestly, I was fully awake. I love the work that you did. So, as someone who has taken part of these agroforestry projects, I'd like to say these are really great projects, and most of them they're really community driven. And I would like to see like maybe further work being done on it. Like the bed research that you did is one of the ways to find out how like the system is working. And I don't know if they're also doing like soil analysis as well. It would be a very good way to also measure how the biodiversity is like improving from the rich places of the forest area where there's no like farming at all, and the mixed one and the one where there's more crops. If you like maybe soil profiling, also looking at the microorganisms as well, because I mean the birds are, it's one thing to record the birds like on the sky, and then also there's a lot happening like on the microclimate as well. I can see the spiders and stuff. I really love your work though.
Thank you so much. If you look at my supervisor's papers, Dr. Marco Campera, he's done a lot of work on soil quality in different agroforests. So he's done that work in Java as well. So he's looked at shaded and non-shaded coffee farms in Java, and then I think they found that shaded coffee farms had more acidic soil, which is healthier. And then we also have soil data from Bali. So like if you check out his papers, you can like see all of the soil analysis that's already been done. And yeah, we are also looking at invertebrates. And I spent a lot of, like couple of months last year just collecting a lot of insects in Bali. And then I realized there's no way I can like identify all of them by myself. So that's why I'm just focusing on spiders. But we are doing invertebrate stuff as well.
Hi, yes, it was amazing. I just have a curiosity. In the crop, they do use native trees. Do they also use them for a purpose? Like, do they actually want to do timber, or like they extract something from it, or it's just they have it there?
So the rustic system, where there's a lot of the native forestries, it's an initiative by the Indonesian government called a social forestry program. So they kind of gave access to the farmers to grow crops, and they're not allowed to cut the native forest trees. So the village that I was working in, they don't cut the forest trees very much at all, which is why I'm gonna go back. If you look at the satellite data, you can't tell apart the rustic forest from the protected forest. If you look on Google Earth, it looks almost the same because that like tall canopy of forest trees still exists. In other villages, we're not sure if they practice that well or not. There's also a lot of like religious factors that go into this because some of the trees in the forest are of religious significance to them, so they don't touch them because of that. So no, they don't use them for any purpose. They're not allowed to cut them or do anything with them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Nice presentation. I was just wondering if you care about which tree species support more bird species, especially insectivorous bird.
Can you repeat the question?
Do you care about which tree species support more bird species? insectivorous birds?
So in the invertivore birds like diverse crops and diverse trees. As for which species, I don't know because I haven't like analyzed that. But I can tell you that the forest trees in the rustic forest, a lot of them are like fig trees, banyan trees, like like Iliocarpus, and like a lot of these big like the rainforest trees that you get in Southeast Asia. And then the crop types, right? So they also like having a high number of crop types. The crops are like coffee, banana, vanilla, cocoa, nutmeg, durian, mangosteen, like bunch of stuff. Dragon fruit also, I think, yeah.
Thank you very much, Vinny. If you have additional questions, you'll have plenty of time during the coffee break. So we are waiting for you in 20 minutes for the rest of the conservation session. Thank you. All right, all right. Sorry. We are going to start again. Thank you all. And now, if you're still recovering from yesterday's festivities, get ready because the next presentation is going to make some noise. And in fact, it's all about what's known as the trumpet rat. So please, a huge warm welcome for Loan Arguel from the CRBE in Toulouse and from the Conservatoire d'Espace Naturel d'Occitanie in France.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for this introduction. Today, I'm going to present you part of my thesis work, which I'm working at Conservatoire d'Espace Naturel d'Occitanie and CRBE de Toulouse. The goal of this work is to study space use and habitat selection by a mysterious, threatened, and semi-aquatic mammal species, the Pyrenean desman. The Pyrenean desman is an endemic semi-aquatic mammal found only in 4 countries: France, Andorra, Spain, and Portugal. Unfortunately, the species know a severe decline, and today its range is shrinking and fragmenting. Some studies have shown that this decline has reached a local threshold of 80% reduction. So the Pyrenean desman is today is one of the most endangered mammal in species, and today with an unfavorable conservation status, globally endangered and vulnerable in France. But what are the reasons of this decline? As with many species, the reasons of decline are numerous and act in synergy: pollution, predation, climate changes. But among them, the habitat loss, degradation, and fragmentation is a main threat. The Pyrenean desman lives mainly on river mountain. Imagine this poor little animal, only 50 grams, lives in this environment. It's incredible. Unfortunately, this environment is today impacted by humans, and humans cause hydromorphological disturbances. For example, mountain rivers experience period of drastic reduction in flow, such as climate change, wetter wolf for agriculture, or hydroelectricity production. Conversely, this environment experiences periods of sudden increase in flow, such as devastating floods or hydropicking. There are also disturbances of the morphology of the river. So, to act in the conservation and the preservation of its species and its habitat, it's important to acquire knowledge on the habitat-species relationship. So, I try to answer of 3 questions. How does the Pyrenean desman use its aquatic environment? Do topographical and hydraulic characteristics condition the species habitat choices? And if so, what are the differences in topographic and hydraulic characteristics between habitats used and avoided by the species? For this, 13 Pyrenean desmans were captured and monitored in 6 different French Pyrenean rivers between 2014 and 2024. The capture were made using eel nets placed in the river during the night, and individuals were monitored by telemetry continuously for an average of 7 days. In parallel, environmental data were collected. First, on the field, river mapping and description of habitats, available habitats were carried out and allowed to describe 5 meso-habitats: cascades, rapids, step pools, run, and pools. Then topographic surveys were made and made it possible to obtain 2D hydraulics models on the entire station at different flow. And these hydraulic models made it possible to obtaining some topographic characteristics, such as slope and percentage of emerging blocks, and some hydraulic characteristics, such as water height and current speed. First, we looked the amount of time the desman spent in the river over a course of a day. the results show that the descent spends 44% of its time in the river during a day, compared to 56% of its time in its resting sites located on the bank. When the descent is in the river, it doesn't use randomly the environment. Conversely, the Pyrenean descent use some part of its home range, for an average 58%. So during the different phases of activity, the descents make the same movements and use the same areas. So after observing these results, we tried to find out what types of habitat are used and avoided by the Pyrenean descent. The results tended to show that the Pyrenean descent uses more often and spends more time on cascade and step pool, and conversely avoids runs and spools. To go into a little more detail, we looked whether the hydraulic and topographic variable made it possible to discriminate between habitat used and not used by the Pyrenean descent. Results were significant and tended to show that the topographic and hydraulic variables made a separation between habitat unused in blue on the factorial plane and other habitats used on other color on the left factorial plane. Then a PCA on the hydraulic and topographic characteristic were realized, and mixed GLM's models on the axis of factorial plane and a binary variable describing used and not used habitats were released, and highlighted that the slope percentage of emerging blocks or heterogeneity of hydraulic characteristics conditions the choice of habitat by the species. Indeed, the Pyrenean descent tended to select positively habitat characteristic by slope and percentage of emerging blocks between 10 and 20%, and intermediate hydraulic characteristics. And conversely, the Pyrenean descent tended to avoid habitats characterized by slope and percentage of emerging blocks of 0, and low or high water height and high current speed, and low current speed, sorry. In conclusion to this study, the Pyrenean descent spends a relatively large amount of time in aquatic environments, mainly to feed on benthic macroinvertebrates. The Pyrenean descent does not randomly use the environment and is faithful to specific feeding areas, which means it knows and perceives this environment perfectly. The Pyrenean descent uses cascade and step pools and avoids run and pools with some characteristic seen previously. And the choice of habitat is based on the topographic and hydraulic characteristics. Several explanatory hypotheses exist to explain these results. For example, cascade and step pool are more stable habitats against hydromorphological disturbances than the runs and pools. The cascade and step pools are habitat providing shelter from predators or the current. In run and pools, the Pyrenean descent is more exposed to predator and current. In cascade and step pool, habitats that counter the natural buoyancy of the species, but in run and pool, it's more difficult for the descent to stay on the river bottom, sorry. And to finish, cascade and step pool have a specific and stable trophic resource than the runs and pools. So this study provides new insight to space use in a difficult to study and mysterious mammals, provides important information on the ecological preferences in terms of habitat, and it's necessary to implement management and conservation actions, and provides additional questions and open up interesting avenues of research. For example, on downstream of a dam, in bypass section, cascade and step pool are generally absent. So in this environment, does the perenne enhancement survive? And if so, what are the habitats selected? I would like to thank all my supervisors, all my collaborators, funders. I would like to thank again all the people who helped me in the field for data collection, and particularly Christophe Andalo, Gaël Grenouillet, and Laetitia Bussian for their help in data analysis. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, it's a really cool species. How do you catch it exactly in the river?
The catch?
Are you sampling in different part of the river, or it's all the time in certain part of the river?
I catch the perenne enhancement on 1 kilometer of river and focus on turbulent mesohabitats. It's more easier to capture the species in this environment, like in the runs or pools.
So when you put your trap in a turbulent habitat, how do you think it biases your result to find basically individuals who are specialized in using the turbulent habitat?
Sorry, it's possible to speak in French for the question. Sorry.
En gros, ce que j'ai demandé, c'est si tu mets tes pièges à des endroits qui sont turbulents, comment est-ce que tu penses que ça biaise un peu tes résultats? Parce que du coup, tu vas trouver des individus qui sont spécialisés pour un milieu turbulent. Et c'est peut-être pour ça que tu trouves qu'en général, ils aiment plutôt le milieu turbulent que calme.
Ok. Bon, je vais continuer du coup en français, ce sera plus simple pour moi. Désolé. Nous, on a ciblé des cours d'eau qui sont assez naturels, les plus naturels possibles. L'objectif au départ, c'est de montrer, étudier son comportement en milieu naturel. Et en fait, sur ces cours d'eau, il évolue sur 300 mètres de linéaire et on a essayé d'avoir des habitats assez différents aussi, avec des plats, des profonds et des cascades. Donc certes, on les capture dans des cascades, mais après, ils vont évoluer au-delà des cascades et ils vont aller plus loin. Et en fait, on voit qu'ils traversent les plats et les profonds sans s'y arrêter et qu'ils vont aller au-delà sur d'autres cascades après.
Just for the people who don't speak French, basically, it doesn't seem that there is too much bias because you sample actually in different microhabitat and it's turbulent, but also with different other characteristics that make eventually less turbulence. If I translate it good.
If you want, I have a short video. Yes, you're doing. Continue. Just on the release after capture. Look here. Be careful, it's very fast. They hope. Ciao.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very. Ok. Là, c'est bon. Ok. Yes, you talk about the space use of the Desmond. So, did you studies like the home range and maybe the sociability? So, in the same part of the river, can we find different Desmond? Did they sleep together? How did it work? Do you know a bit about it?
Yeah. Among the 13 perenne desmond capture, we have 4 desmond on the same home range, the same resting site, and release the same movements at the same time. And it's very interesting because we don't have the information of social species today, and it's the first results to possibly social interaction between individuals.
And do you know if it's the same family or it's just no? You can.
We don't know.
Okay.
I release analysis genetics, but on the same population in the same home range, there is important consanguinity effects on the population, and it's threatening for the species in the long term.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Now I want to keep my eyes open to see the Desman when I go to Pyrenees, but how often is it easy to see? Not really, right? Okay.
No.
Because I wanted to ask you if you could explain a bit more about the habitat, because I didn't understand very well that how you differentiate between step pools and pools. So maybe you could add a bit about that.
I understand.
Slower, maybe. So difference between pools and step pools.
Yeah.
And if it's possible to see in the wild.
Yeah. For example, during my free thesis, I've seen the Desmond only on one, or during all the monitoring. And in pools, I don't see. It's on the bottom between the rocks, and it's very difficult to see in monitoring.
Thank you.
All right. All right, some attention, please, because our next presentation is going to be about PhD students gathering around free food at a gala buffet. Well, no, vultures and feeding station. Please give a big, very warm welcome for Gaël Picon from this very own lab.
Hi everyone. So today I'm going to present some results of an analysis we ran recently on griffon vultures in France and on the feeding sites they use. So to answer this question, where do vultures feed? Using biologging to quantify the real use of supplementary feeding stations. So this question raises into the context of the elimination of livestock carcasses in France, which basically you can do in two ways. The industrial way, like just calling a truck that will collect your carcasses and bring it to incineration, for instance. But in some countries, you can also rely on the help of vultures and other scavengers on what I will call here individual or collective recycling stations with vultures, so IRSV or CRSV. These recycling stations were first some conservation tools to help the recovery of vultures in France and other countries too. But now that population recovered a bit, there are also some devices to help create a mutualism, well, an ancient mutualism between farmers and vultures, with farmers providing food resources to vultures that directly eliminates carcasses with less, well, no carbon emission, for instance, also no money to invest on it because you don't have to pay a vulture to eat your carcasses, as far as I know. So our question here was, to what extent do vultures rely on these recycling stations in France? We had several sub-questions for this. So what is the proportion of food resources vultures find in the wild in comparison with the recycling stations? Are there some spatial temporal variations in this proportion? Are there different feeding strategies among individuals? And finally, where these feeding sites found in the wild are located. So our study area was in France and Spain for this. So in the Pyrenees, in the coast, in green, and in the Alps, in blue. We used the tracking data of 129 individuals. It was GPS and accelerometric data, and we used them between 2018 and 2025. Also, the black stars you can see on the big regions are the capture sites, but it also represents the fact that we have several colonies composing these big regions. And I will come back on this later. So from these tracking data, we first wanted to keep only ground locations because we were interested in feeding events. So once we have them, we discriminated different behavior thanks to accelerometric data between feeding, likely feeding, and resting events. And once we have this, we could identify some feeding sites that were composed of feeding events from one or several individuals, one or several days, and that were located at less than 200 meters from each other. And then we checked where these feeding sites were located, and particularly if they were located in the vicinity of any reference site. So for instance, a recycling station, but also landfills in the Pyrenees or water points or things like this. And if they were close enough, they were associated to this site. And if they were not, they were called unreferenced feeding sites, which I will call then UFS, and which is the acronym you want to remember for the rest of this presentation. So when for our result, first, we found a very great majority of UFS compared with feeding sites associated with recycling stations. So we could identify almost 25,000 feeding events that happened in 13,000 feeding different sites. Among these sites, so 98% were UFS. So they were not associated to any known site as we know. And regarding the feeding events this time, 90% of them happened at UFS, so not in recycling station, for instance. But there were some regional variations that I show here. And so, for instance, in the Pyrenees, it was 95% that happened of feeding events that happened in UFS, whereas in the coast, it was only 76% of them. So which means that in the coast, a greater majority, a greater proportion of feeding events happened at recycling stations compared with the Pyrenees, where recycling stations were not that used. So we first could see some regional variations, but still at a population level. So we wanted to have a look at an individual scale then. So which is what you can see here. This is the variation of the proportion of feeding events that happen at UFS per individual across the study period. So the x-axis is the duration of the monitoring. On the y-axis, it's the proportion of feeding events at UFS. And then you have one curve per individual. So among different things, what we see here is that we have some individual variability, but it is greater in the coast compared with the other regions. So for instance, you can see this individual has his feeding event that happened at 50% at UFS, whereas this one here was almost 80% of its feeding events that happened at UFS. So it means also that this one used much more recycling stations. And then we can see that in the other regions, this variation was to a lesser extent. So we saw this individual variation different in the different regions. But then, as I explained later before, we had several colonies that composed our big regions. So we wondered whether there could be also an effect of this colony. So we divided our region in different subregions. So for instance, we grouped these two into Eastern Pyrenees. We also grouped these two, and then we compared them. So which is what you see here. These are so pairwise comparison of the probability of feeding at UFS between subregions. And there are several things to say here, but one of the things I wanted to underline was that we have a special case here that is called Basque Country. And what this means in this graph is that here, as long as you have Basque Country, well, vultures in Basque countries always have a very greater probability of feeding at UFS compared with every other subregion. So this could be explained by several things, but we thought of two hypotheses. First, weather conditions in these regions allow livestock to graze outside most of the year, so it means also that there are some carcasses available all year long, more or less. And also there are some human practices that can explain this, because in Basque Country and in Pyrenees in general, vultures never really disappeared, whereas they did in the other region. And so we think that farmers may kept the habit of feeding vultures with their carcasses without any legal framework or anything, because it's a quite recent thing. So we think that in this region we also have a greater proportion of illegal dropping of carcasses that can explain this difference. And then we wanted also to check where these UFS were located, and so what kind of landscape variables drove the probability of their locations. So without great surprise, they were more likely to be located in pasture lands, so open areas with probably more carcasses available. They were also close to a reference site and in steep terrains. So it's not very surprising results, but then we also wanted to focus on special UFS because some of them were very much frequented by vultures. Like for some of them, we could count 50 different feeding events. So it means that these are places where we have very regularly some carcasses for vultures. So we think it's human induced. And so when we focused on them, we saw that they were more likely to be close to a reference site, but also further from human activities, which goes in the way of our hypothesis of human origin of these sites, because dropping the carcasses without any recycling station is illegal. So you may want to be away from other people to see what you do, probably. But also being closer to a reference site, it means also that there is a higher probability of the carcasses illegally dropped to be eaten and by vultures. So if we synthesize what we found here in this analysis, we found that green vultures in France mostly rely on non-managed food resources, which is consistent with some analysis, but some would say the opposite, like in Spain, for instance, or Israel. Vultures rely much more on anthropogenic food resources. But it was also consistent with a similar analysis in Bulgaria, so there are country differences. But there is some variation in the feeding strategy that were partially explained by individual features, for instance, but they were mostly driven by geographical context, and more particularly by some local human practices. For instance, if you use or not a recycling station, if the different farming practices you are using as a farmer, but also the different practices of hunter and of hunting deposits that can happen sometimes, and that can also feed vultures. So this was also quite consistent with other analysis similar to this one. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned that in Pays Basque, there was always a population of griffon vultures, in contrary to the coast. And you also mentioned that their farmers would keep this illegal activity of leaving the carcasses. Do you think that would explain the fact that there has been a stable population of griffon vultures, in contrary to the other place you studied?
Well, I think in the Pyrenees they never really get extinct because it was thanks to Spanish people. Because in France we just exterminated vultures, so that's why they disappeared from coast, and then they were and in the Alps, and they were reintroduced. So it's most likely thanks to the Spanish population. Thanks.
Thank you for your talk. It was really interesting. I was wondering if you tried to assess the differences in use of the recycling stations in between the regions. For example, are they much more used in the coast than anywhere else? And do you have numbers around that?
Yes, in fact, well, we have different kind of figures that can show it, but this is one kind of figure that show this because it's so the proportion of feeding events at UFS compared with the use of recycling stations. So, well, in the coast, vultures rely a bit more on recycling stations, but then there are also other differences between this region, like the number of recycling stations also. So these are the gray points you see. These are recycling stations or landfills in Spain. So we can see that there is a very high proportion also, well, a high concentration of recycling stations. So this can be also explained by this number of feeding stations that are quite old now.
Thank you. Hello, thank you for the presentation. Did you have any temporal information? I mean, did you know if that behavior is increasing? For example, for the specimen, the individual that is almost every time eating on the specific place that you put the meat. So it is increasing over time. It's a new habit, so no.
Well, we had a look at temporal variations, but mostly between seasons. And so we had some seasonal variations in the coast, mostly, where in autumn, this proportion of feeding events at UFS increased a lot. And that may be explained by the hunting season, because it also means availability of carcasses for vultures. And then we could have a look at variations in year to see if there were some year effect. And we did not found any, but we also, well, we couldn't track all the vultures from 2018 to 25. So we didn't have many individuals that were tracked in such a long time.
Thank you.
A great presentation and great research that you are doing there. I wanted to find out from you, because from 2018 to 2025 seems like a long, like a period of study, and the way that you might have filtered the data sets a bit like it's unclear on the fact that your first question was like, what are the vultures feeding on, since they are not feeding on like is it like the feeding sites? Also, my question is it not the same vultures moving from as far as one side to the other? Because like vultures move a lot, especially the Gifford vultures. Is there a high chance that it's the same vultures that are moving from one place to another? Because it's like very close to each other as well.
So you mean your question is if some of the individuals are moving from one of these regions to another?
Yes.
That could explain some proportions? I mean, like if the ones from coast, for instance, could move to the Alps and...
Yes.
They stayed much in these regions, in fact, and we also, for the analysis it was a bit complicated, but we cropped a bit the region, and so when we had our vulture location, we had to crop like this the region. So our individuals that were tagged in the coast, for instance, if they moved, outside of this region to the Alps, we didn't have a look at the feeding events. So we only checked the feeding events of coast vultures in the coast, of alpine vultures in the Alps. And
Also, you'd filter them out if they cross to another region.
yes,
Okay.
yes, because at the first time it was more for a local conservation purpose, so that's why. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, and for now we are finally moving out of vertebrates into the world of what we call the non-vertebrates. And apparently, dragons belong to the non-vertebrates, but I guess it's a matter of traits. So please welcome Lisa Nickver from the FRB from France, who will share her work on the dragonflies.
Thanks for the warm welcome for me and for the dragonflies. So I'm going to present the results from my current postdoc project on dragonflies here at CISAB in Montpellier. So as you know, there are currently global changes affecting species, and these species respond differently to these changes. Different species respond differently. So we have some species that seem to be really vulnerable to these changes, while others seem to be doing quite great. And the main question we're going to address in this presentation is why is that? So the current framework to understand species vulnerability is to relate this vulnerability to global changes to the exposure to the different pressures. Combined with the sensitivity of species to these pressures and also their adaptive capacity, so to mitigate these changes. So basically, these two last quantities are thought to be largely driven or at least related to the traits of the species. And so traits can be used as a mechanistic framework, a driver to understand the vulnerability of species. And here I'm going to focus on dragonflies, the order Odonata. There are more than 6,000 species worldwide, and here I am going to focus on the species in Europe, which are still rather diverse, more than 140 species. They are highly dependent on freshwater environments for their life cycle because the larvae use the freshwater to live in. And these freshwater environments have been found to be under high stress and highly threatened, with as much as 1/4 of the biodiversity of these freshwater environment being threatened. And in Europe, there was a recent assessment with the European Red List of the stages of dragonflies. And as you can see, we have a variety of responses of the different species across Europe. So the main question here I'm going to address is how do these traits relate to the species vulnerability for European Odonata? And more particularly, which traits and how well do they explain this vulnerability? So we focused on a list of more than 120 species, for which we had 12 species traits, various traits from morphology, physiology, describing their phenology as well, their behavior and their ecology. So as you can see, a wide array of traits. And we related them to 3 conservation indicators that were used for the European Red List, which are the distribution trend of the species, so whether the distribution of the species is decreasing, stable, or increasing. The area of occupancy, quantified as the number of the area of squares, 2 by 2 kilometer squares occupied by the species, and their Red List status as assessed by the Red List. And all these data are currently being prepared to be published as a database of species traits. So to investigate the question, we used multivariate analysis, for which we related one conservation indicator vector here with the matrix of species traits we gathered. And we used either discriminant analysis to analyze the response of the qualitative variables and redundancy analysis to analyze the response of the qualitative variable, which was the area of occupancy. Regarding the results we obtained, for the distribution trends, here is the factorial plane with the trait space. So on this graph, each point represents one species, and they are grouped according to their distribution trend status. And these 2 axes that you see here are the ones that best separate the different trend categories by using a linear combination of the species traits we had. So in the following, I'm going to interpret the results on the first axis of this plane because it is the one that best separates the decreasing from the increasing species. And here are how the different traits we used relate to these axes. So it's a lot of traits I'm going to summarize. On the left-hand side, we can see the traits more associated to the decreasing species. So we can obtain a typology, kind of typology of decreasing species. So your typical decreasing species could be Leucorrhenia albifrons. Whereas on the right-hand side, we have the increasing species. So you can see a pattern here that the habitat is important. Decreasing species tend to be specialists of nutrient-poor environment, have low thermal preferences, so in contrary to the increasing species. These decreasing species also have a short fly season and a long generation time on average. So another question we wanted to investigate is how well do these traits, we can see that there is a relationship, right? But how well does it explain the trends? To do that, we used a multinomial GLM using these axes, for which we computed a measure of relatedness with the pseudo R-square, McFadden pseudo R-square, which was 0.51. Now let's move on to the next conservation indicator, which was the area of occupancy. So here, this multivariate analysis leads only a single dimension because of the nature of the explanatory variable. And here you can see the traits related to the smaller area of occupancy contrary to the larger area of occupancy. So species which are typical of Mediterranean streams tend to perform sediment oviposition and have high thermal preferences, tend to have a small range, whereas the larger ranges are typical for species having a wider thermal range adapted to more diverse thermic conditions, being more nutrient-rich specialists and having a medium generation time. All the same, we quantified the part of variation explained on the status by these traits, which amounted to 0.65. And finally, regarding the red list category, so here the graph is more similar to the one we obtained with the first analysis. Oops. And you can see that the threatened species, so the categories corresponding to threatened species tend to be on the left-hand side, and the least concerned species tend to occupy the right-hand side. So again, I'm going to focus on the first axis. Here are how the traits are related to this axis. And here are the main traits contributing to this first axis. So here we can find the traits which are very similar to the ones we found for the distribution trends, with the addition that the threatened species are not only nutrient-poor specialists, they can also be Mediterranean stream specialists. And their thermal range seems to play a role. And we find also the short flight season and the long generation time, like in the first analysis. Again, to quantify the part of variability explained by the traits, we used the pseudo R-square and the measure was 0.48. So in this analysis, we related the vulnerability status of species to their traits, and we obtained overall a strong relationship for the different measures considered, which is notable because if you remember, I described the vulnerability framework as being partly driven by traits, but not only, being a combination of different factors. So that was quite striking to me that traits could explain as much, even though this analysis is preliminary and exploratory. It seems worth investigating. Also, this vulnerability was measured with different indicators. The distribution trend can be interpreted as being a snapshot of the status of species, how they are doing right now. And so they could quantify more the result of the short-term pressures. Whereas the area of occupancy, it's more indicative of long-term range constraints on the species.
And the red list category, here it's an integrative measure actually combining these two, it's computed from these two indicators. And here, all these measures were related to traits relative to similar categories, which are the habitat of the species, its generation time, and the thermal preferences, either the range or the thermal optimum. So these results highlight the usability and the fact that trait-based approaches could be useful for conservation, either for forecasting purposes. So we could imagine that a species for which we don't have access to distribution data and for which it is difficult to evaluate precisely the conservation status, it could be forecasted or approximated with its traits, especially in the case of dragonflies. It could also be used for monitoring purposes. So indicators are a popular method to do so, and there are several indicators that rely on species groups determined by their traits, like the grassland butterfly indicator or the farmland birds indicator. And we could envision the same approach for, let's say, small oligotrophic pond dragonflies, and also to understand what drives these pressures, because, as I told you, the traits can be understood as a mechanistic driver. But for that, of course, good knowledge of trait data is needed, and even though it is kind of easier to obtain than precise range estimates or abundance estimates of species, it's still a challenge to collect sometimes. So thank you for your attention, everyone in the room, and also to people online. Merci beaucoup. And I also want to acknowledge the work of the members of the Dragon Consortium. So these are people who collaborated with me on this project and who are also co-authors of this analysis I presented. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your talk. Just a very naive question. Like in the trade for the non-threatened species, you have like the rich environment specialists, right? And I was just wondering if you have any idea of why this trait is for like short generation time. I can understand like in the worse and degrading environment, but this one seems a bit curious compared to the other. Do you have like any hypothesis about that?
Do you mean the fact that it is related to conservation indicators, or?
Yeah, like it's like I would have expected like this to be in the non-threatened group instead of this one.
Yes, yes, it is. I think actually the species which are specialists or more nutrient-rich environments, they are faring pretty well. They are related to the least concerned species and also range expanding species.
Okay, thank you very much.
And so for our next presentation, before our next presentation, I'll have a small question. So have you ever wondered how the birds perceive and see exactly like their environment? Well, maybe the wind farm, the people that those who developed wind farm surely did not. But lucky us, the research did. So our next presentation will dive into the surprisingly little we know about how birds perceive wind farms. So please give a very warm welcome to Lucie Foucault from our very own center, CEF. Welcome.
All right, thank you for having me for this conference. I'm happy to sharing you my master's internship that I did last year with Constance Blary and Olivier Durez about birds and wind turbines. So globally, we know that wind power production increase every year in the world. So we know that it can have negative impacts on biodiversity and especially on birds. For example, mortality by collisions. And for example, we can have 8 bird collisions per wind turbine per year for Canada, 7 for France, or 3 for Japan. And to manage that, some automatic detection systems have been put in on some wind turbine, which is a camera and an informatic systems that can detect a bird approaching and also predicts its trajectory, and if it predicts to cross the rotor zone, so if it will be in danger, it will order to slow down the wind turbine to around 3 rotation per minute, RPM, which, keep that in mind, corresponds to 50 kilometers per hour at the end of the tail. So which is really rapid, and it assumes that birds are able to detect the wind turbine at slow speeds, and that we don't know that much about that. And this is one of the big questions, is how birds see the rotation of wind turbines and how we can improve this mitigations measure. So as you know, the visual system of birds is different than from humans, and especially their contrast sensitivity is lower than from us. And so if sometimes it's difficult for us to differentiate a wind turbine with gray clouds behind it, we can imagine that for birds it's the same also. And sometimes they can also face visual challenges of seeing a moving object, and especially a cycle movement, which is not really natural. So one of the idea is to increase the contrast between the turbine and its background. For example, Mayall in 2020 in Norway tried to paint one pale in black, and it was to test also the motion blur. When it's moving really, really fast, it's blurring. So it was quite encouraging because it reduced mortality of one species of raptor. And also we had meeting in banks in 2023 that suggest a strip pattern. So to increase the detectability of wind turbines, we need a pattern that is detectable at a great distance, limits the motion blur when it's going really fast, and also improve the detection at low speeds, and also help birds to predict the trajectory of the blaze or to better understand this cycle movement. And so we designed 4 patterns. So the white one, which will be the control one, the black blade and the strip pattern, and a new one, the check patterns, and which reach some of the conditions that we had to be maybe the best or not pattern. So the big question here is which pattern can be the most effective to improve the detection of blade rotation by birds. And our hypothesis was maybe it will be the strip or the check patterns, but we don't know which one. So we tested experimentally with mini wind turbine and also with captive birds. So with 5 black kites and 1 griffer vulture from the French zoo Puy du Fou, and also with 6 homing pigeons from here at the CEF. And the experimental setup was to operant condition the birds, so to make them learn to recognize if the mini wind turbine is moving or not. So they are on the perch at the center. They faced one wind turbine that is rotating and one that is not. And if they reach the perch that is in front of the one that is not rotating, they will have a reward, which is food. And if they reach the one that is rotating, they will have nothing. So with a lot of training every day, they have learned that how to differentiate the one that is rotating and the one that is not. So this was the conditioning phase, just to train them. And then when we are statistically sure that they learn that, we had some others patterns, so the strip and the check patterns, and also at different speeds, and in particular at 1 and 5 RPM, which was the most interesting for us. So about the data analysis, we did some binomial tests to know if there is a threshold speed under the one that they are not able to see the difference when it's moving or not. And also GLMs to know which parameters can influence these thresholds, which if can be speed, pattern, contrast. So some of the results, if we have the percentage of success to make a difference when it's rotating or not, and with rotation speed, in rotation per minute, and at around 70%, you will have the statistical threshold under the one that are not able to make a difference when it's rotating or not, so they were wrong, they were choosing the one that is rotating. And if they are upper this threshold, it's because they're able to make this difference. So in brown, we will have the kites, in green, the pigeons, and in blue, the vulture. So if we focus only at the slow rotation at 1 and at 5 RPM, we can see that for vulture, it's difficult for them. They are not able to make a difference. And it's the same for pigeons. These results were with the control pattern. With the one black blade, we can see that it's more difficult for vulture at 5 RPM and also at 1. It's also difficult for kites at 1 RPM and also for pigeons. With the strip pattern, we can see that, well, it's also always difficult for vulture at 1 RPM, also for pigeons, but for kites it's better. And for the checked patterns, it's difficult for vulture at 1 and 5, for pigeons at 1, but for kites, it's good. So here I will present you the percentage of success with every rotation speed, and we will focus only on the slow speeds, what's interested us. And in the thick line, we will have the control pattern. The thick thick line, you will have the one black blade, and then the dash thick line will be the strip, and the thin dash line will be the check pattern. So here we have, let me explain you the plots. If we focus only at the slow speed, the top lines are the thin line and also the thick dash line. So it corresponds to the black, to the white and to the strip patterns for the pigeons here. And here for the kites, and if we look at the top lines, it's the dash lines, which corresponds to the strip and the check pattern. So, in conclusions, we knew that between 1 and 5 RPM, it's difficult for them to make a difference when it's rotating or not. So maybe at this low speed, they maybe tend to think that it's okay, it's not moving, so maybe they can cross into the rotor zone or maybe going next to that, but in fact, it's around 50 kilometers per hour, so it can be deadly. So maybe they can make the bad decisions. So maybe the idea that is slowing down when it's approaching, maybe it's not effective for some bird species. So here we have the patterns that maybe can help to make a difference at low speed. And for pigeons and vultures, we can see that it was the same. The best one are so the control one and the strip patterns. And for the kites, it's the strip pattern and the check pattern. So the most compromised one is the strip pattern. So we saw that if we decrease the contrast between the wind turbine and the background, it also decreases the probability of detecting rotation by birds. And the strip pattern is the most effective. This is what we saw with this species. And we recommend to paint also the turbine mats. It could increase also the efficiency, and add the ADS could be the most effective means of preventive collisions. So that's why we recommended to do an in-situ study with the strip patterns on blades and mats, and with radar-based ornithological monitoring to know if it can be better for them. Thanks for listening, and I'm here for also questions.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. It was really interesting. It's just a quick question about your graphs. I think it's on the first ones. And for the vultures, there's only 1 point and no confidence interval. Is it because you only have one individual?
Yes, exactly. In fact, we tried with 5 individuals, but at least just one were conditioned to the experiment. It was really difficult with vulture. They are also at the zoo. They are used to show in front of the public, so it was difficult to manage our experiment and their show because there are really stars there. So, well, it was with just one individual. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm not very aware of the literature, but I remember reading that one of the main problem of bird collision to wind turbine is not that they don't see it, is that they don't look in front of them because they look at the ground while they are flying, because usually there's nothing in the middle of the sky at that height. And here in your protocol, they're all standing up, so it's a bit different because then they can move their head around. And so do you think that different species do that differently, and that it's still useful to do for some species because some species actually will look ahead? Or
Yeah, it's really interesting questions. And especially for vulture, we always had this image that they are looking on the ground to search for food and not looking at in front of them. You're right. That's why there is a lot of collisions. And that's why also we tested with the checked patterns, because we think that maybe it can be really struggle them. Maybe if they are in front of them, well, at least they will find the wind turbines. I mean, bees will be really struck with this pattern, and this is why we wanted to increase contrast to make it more visible, even if maybe they will not check in front of them what is going on, but maybe they will, I don't know, maybe hear about the noise of the machine also. So maybe one they are in front of the turbine, they will, oh, okay, it can be dangerous. So maybe increasing the contrast can help to strike them and to be aware of what is going on in front of them.
Thanks for the presentation. My question is actually a little bit related to what has been just said. It's like now you test them in this perfect setup where they can really see in front of them the wind turbine. So did you try a bit like if I don't know, the blade are actually inclined on the side to see in a bit more general context how this will affect the birds?
Yeah, it can be really interesting. This is what we didn't test that. We test just if they are in front of the turbine first. But this is why it can be really interesting in situ experimentation. It can be more easier to test if they are in front or from the right or from the left. And also, it's also someone mentioned that we can also maybe add some pattern on the côté, I don't know how to say, but yeah, on the épaisseur, side, yeah, sorry, of the blade also, maybe to improve when they are not looking at in front. So maybe, yes, it's a tricky question also.
In situ, we'll say what's going to happen. Cool, thanks.
You.
So in this session, we've explored the impact of climate, land use, and conservation management to understand how these forces shape our biodiversity. And what a better way to close the session and the conference than with a talk that brings it together. with a special focus on insects. So please welcome Benoît Penel from the Institut National de la Recherche pour l'Agriculture, right here in Montpellier, for our very last talk of the conference.
Hello, thank you for the short introduction. So yeah, today I'm going to speak about the major entomological community that occur in France and their relationship with climate, landscape, feature and management intensity. And those work are part of my PhD that I'm currently finishing in the CBGP. So you probably know insects are involved in so many ecosystemic services that have a huge economic value. And we can see, for example, in that picture that came from De Castro Arrazola, that shuts, insects such as dung beetle are displaying many ecosystemic services that is important for agroecosystem, such as pollination that is on which we are dependent. For example, 25% of human crops depend on pollination service. And just an example, those ecosystemic services are evaluated at 57 billion of US dollars annually just in USA. However, the issue is that we observe a sharp decline of the insect biodiversity. Like you can observe in that graph at Alman, we observe a decline over the 3 last decades. That decline is up to 75% of the biomass, and it's even more worse in the agricultural landscape and reach 95%. And overall, we also observe that 40% of the world insect species are threatened with extinction in the coming decade. That decline have many origins. We can speak about climate change for sure, but agricultural practice and the intensification of them are one of the major threatening factors, and that involve the landscape simplification and the pesticide use. However, the issue about that even if we have some information about it, we don't have a well understanding of everything. I mean, like it have been reported this morning on the conferences of the key speaker, most of the information and data that we have is on vertebrates, and insects have very few information about it. So we have a big lake of knowledge about insects. And even when we study insect, most of the time we study it like a whole. We don't do any distinction between species. And that's kind of a big mistake because it's the most diverse animal taxa. So when you do it like a whole, you can't see the different response according to different factors that impact them. And when we are studying the insect, most of the time we are studying the same species like Hymenoptera and bees. And this is not linked to the fact that those taxonomic groups are more diversified than others. And we just have a disequilibrium that you can observe here on that graph on the right, with beetles, for example, that third more diversified than bees, but bee twice more studied than beetles. And overall, we also have most of our information and knowledge about insects that have been produced on small spatial scale, small temporal scale, and focus on few environmental factors. We don't combine everything at the same time. So overall, this is impeding our conservation action and yeah. So in our study, we wanted to fill the gap of our knowledge on large scale on insects. And we wanted to answer simple question like this one: how many species occur in agroecosystem in France? What service do they support? Are there any specific species assemblage? If so, what is their taxonomic and functional feature? What are shaping those community? And how do insect richness evolve within agroecosystem in relation to climate, landscape, and agricultural practice, taking all together? So to do that, we rely on a national monitoring network that occurs in France. It's the 500 network. And this network is monitoring 500 fields across France, and they're following the 4 main crops that occur in France: wheat, maize, vineyard, lettuce. And yeah, they're monitoring those crops, and they're gathering a lot of information about the practice that have been done on those crops since 2012. And they are also doing some entomological sampling in those field margin. It's the uncrop vegetation just around the crops. That's a very interesting semi-natural habitats that act like a corridor for insect and refugia for biodiversity in general. And so yeah, we rely on this monitoring network, and in our study we just had an additional step. We do the identification of those insects, and more specifically the beetles that have been caught in that network by using molecular approaches that have been improved with some morphological key check. And this have been the production of my first chapter of my thesis. And if you are interested by that, I could speak a bit about that later for the question. But here, the result of that characterization of beetles community in France, we observe more than approximately 800 species of beetles in French agroecosystem. But our estimation are more close than 1,200 species of beetles that occur on the sphere margin. It is approximately 10% of the French coleoptera fauna. However, we only use one strategy of sampling. We use some sweeping strategy, and we catch only the species that occur on the vegetation. We haven't catch the one that is in the floor or on the floor. So that estimation of 10% is at least. We should have even more species that occur on those French agroecosystem. So it shows that agroecosystems are very diverse habitats, for insects. And among those species, we can observe that some of them are involved in flower visitor behavior, so probably involved in pollination services, other auxiliary species, and those involved in pest regulation. And of course, some of them are also some pest species, but only few of them were of concern. But the important information here is, again, we have a huge part of our insect that we don't know nothing. We don't have any information of the ecology. That's just highlighting, again, that we don't know that much about insects. And another important result of that study was that we found different distinct community typology of insects in France agroecosystem, 5, and each of them were associated with a specific taxonomic and functional feature. Some community cluster was associated with specific but rare species, other with unspecific but abundance. And overall, each community was associated with some specific disservice and services, ecosystemic services. I'm not going to speak more about those particular features of each of those clusters, but if you are interested by the feature of them, I'm going to let you use the QR code to have access to the preprint. And today I'm going to more speak about what is shaping those community, the factor that is shaping them. So like you can observe in that maps, you can see that we have some typology of community that is geographically distinct. Some of them are associated to the south, others with the north, and also a distinction between the eastern and western part of France. And this was mainly linked to the climatic condition. So the climatic condition is the first filter that is acting like a filter, and it making the species assemblage distant. I mean, you have distant species in each community. But you can see on the north, we have kind of an overlaps on the very homogeneous climatic regions. And this was linked to the agricultural practice that we have in that region. We have the same climate, but we are doing different crops cultures, such as vineyard or cereal crops. And this is adding a new filter on the communities, and we are filtering some species from the community that we can observe in that region. And contrary to what we were expecting, we don't observe any impact of the landscape feature, neither the vegetation component, even if it was expected, because we found some very specific vegetation composition according to the region that we follow in our study. However, this vegetation component was impacting the richness of those community. I mean, vegetation component was the most structuring factor of the richness of those community. The height of the vegetation was the most structuring one, and we have kind of the best richness at intermediate value. And the typology of vegetation, which means the composition of the vegetation that occur on the field margin and the landscape, was a second very structuring factor. And that typology was mostly linked to the functional feature of the plant community that we have. So, for example, it's involved the percentage of entomological plants that occur on the area. And another very interesting factor that was impacting this richness was the pesticide use. The more you use pesticide, the less you have richness. So overall, the take-home message here is that this study is the first comprehensive taxonomic and functional characterization of insect community within agroecosystem on a large scale. This agricultural landscape are diverse habitat that host at least 10% of the national beetle fauna. They display distinct community typology with unique taxonomic and functional features that are shaped by climate, agricultural practice, but not vegetation. And insect richness is mainly influenced by vegetation component and agricultural practice. And overall, all those information that we have produced for that research is a new baseline for further and improved monitoring study and the implementation of conservation value for the future to keep those insects safe at the national scale. So to finish, I would like to thank my teams that helped me to produce the data, analyze everything, and write the paper. And I would like also to thank you for being there for the last presentation of the last day. So thank you.
That was a really good talk, and it seems like you've done so much work. And my question for you is, based on everything you've done, what would your recommendation be for the average farmer in France?
Oh. Yeah, that's the difficult question. I mean, the fact is, we have done some work at national scale, but the first step that I would like to say is we should not imply any national recommendation because we show that it's region dependent and we can't do any general assumption, general rules for everyone because they don't have the same agricultural practice. For example, vineyard and cereal crops don't have anything at all in common. So I don't have any example of implementation yet, but I'm gonna think about it. But was the stuff that was interesting is that in most of the study that we read, we speak a lot about landscape and the naturality of this landscape, the quantity of diverse crops that you have and everything. And this was not sure in our results. So I don't know, to be honest, I don't know.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Related to the first question, I wanted to know at what scale you worked, and maybe that will explain why you didn't find an effect of the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, we check the landscape effects at 1 kilometer radius around our sampling port. This is a value that is used in general in the literature, so we follow what we have read, but it can be very dependent of the species. I mean, some species can fly over a very long distance, others gonna stay on the same 10 meter all the life, so it depends. Here we use kind of a average value, so yeah. Thank you.
Okay, ah oui, ok, ça va, pardon. Ouais, so good. Just a few words to conclude the session. Well, I think we had a really good conservation session. I think it showed beautifully how many different